Good evening. Welcome. And we will start with comments from the public regarding items not on the agenda. Seeing none, we'll move on. All right, amendments to the agenda.
We needed to add the Bsba resolution somewhere in here, Elizabeth.
Okay.
Not sure.
How about right before the policy review? Like an 8A? All right, so we're going to add an 8A, and that is Bsba Resolutions for the annual meeting, which commences tomorrow. And I think as part of announcements, Alex is going to talk about the student rep applications. Okay, great. We'll just make that a sub-note. Anything else? We should note we added in executive session a legal matter.
Yeah,
so we have B, a legal matter that we added.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for me.
No problem.
Remembering that.
All right. With those changes, we will move on to announcements.
Go ahead, Alex.
So we have a couple of announcements today, so it might be a little bit longer than usual. So first of all, there is a soccer game happening right now. It is South Burlington High School against Burlington High School, and I'm going to be leaving at around 8 o'clock to go support my peers. On October 12th, Chamberlain teacher Jane Dahl and South Burlington High School teacher Kim Watkin were celebrated as our UVM Outstanding Teachers of the Year at a ceremony at the Davis Center, so that was pretty exciting. There's going to be no school for students on October 19th and 20th, so tomorrow and the day after. There's an in-service for teachers on October 19th. The portable Star Lab Planetarium from the Montshire Museum came to Rick Marquardt Central School this week. Students had the opportunity to explore how the Earth's movement affects day and night and how the Earth's orbit affects seasons variations, which is pretty awesome. The middle school is holding a Socktober sock drive until the end of October. Sock collection bins are located in the lobby for those who are interested. I know also as mentioned that the Fusion team is having a spaghetti dinner at right now.
Tonight, right?
Yeah. Last week on October 11th, we had a couple of events at South Burlington High School. First of all, the PSATs were available for sophomores and juniors, so they took those. During that time, it was SLAM Freshman Community Service Day. They did a lot of stuff in the community, and it was an incredible event, and I know that Mr. Burke created a little slideshow video, and if you go on his Twitter, he linked that, and you can see more about the hashtag that they were using and seeing some photos about the work that they did. It was also International Day of the Girl, and as an event, SBHS hosted, some students from SBHS organized an event and invited Salamawit Aduga Bekel from Ethiopia, who's an international activist, and she was in the multimedia room at South Burlington High School, and they gave an amazing presentation during that time. There was also a statewide GSA conference, Gay Straight Alliance conference, on Friday last week, and myself and some club members went there to represent South Burlington High School, and we had a really productive time, and we met lots of advisors and had some great conversations. Also, South Burlington High School represented the team, the Wolf Pack, at the Breast Cancer Walk last Sunday, and I know that they raised a ton of money for that, so you can look that up, and I know they wrote a little about that, and there are some reflective blog posts out there. The Big Picture had their orientation term exhibition yesterday, so parents of the Big Picture students came together and we got to share our projects and share with everybody the stuff that we've been working on, so that was really fun and exciting. So that's about it for announcements. I'm going to move on to an update on the process of recruiting a second student representative. So I met with Mr. Burke last week, and we discussed next steps and what our plan would be because we wanted to collaborate on getting the word out. So we split up into my job and his job. So my job is basically verifying the application and making sure that it's accessible for students and seeing if there are any revisions. I know that we had emailed about it. And I had suggested potentially adding a reference section. I don't know if this would be super necessary, but it might add a level of professionality. And if we wanted to, if it was down to a few students, for example, and we wanted to reach out to their contacts, then they could vouch on their skills. And
I thought that was a great idea.
Yeah. So that's what I'd suggested. So as soon as the application is just completely 100% finished, done, we're going to distribute it, as in I'm going to draft an email to all juniors. I will then give that email, that draft, to Mr. Burke, who will send it out to the entire class of 2018. And I'm also going to be an in-person resource for anyone who's interested in learning more about it. His job is going to be to email all the students. He's also going to mention it on the digital announcements, and he's going to advertise it on social media. So our hope is that students would be interested and contact me, contact Mr. Burke, start getting applications. In the chance that student recruitment isn't working too well and we only have a couple of students, we can also go the direction of Plan B, speaking to teachers and advisors and guidance counselors to recommend students. I know that's what we did last year, so that is our backup plan if for some reason the general announcement wasn't working. So yeah, that's our plan at the moment, and hopefully we will start getting, next week we're gonna send out the email and we'll start receiving applications after we announce that, yeah.
So Alex did come up with the idea of adding the reference or references onto the application. So unless there's any objection to that, I think we should go ahead and do that.
Okay.
Awesome. And then did you and Mr. Burke discuss a timeline for kind of narrowing down candidates or even having the conversations with whoever might apply?
Not just yet. We wanted to see if people were applying first and check in with you all already. But I'm sure we would have a follow-up meeting once we get the announcements out. And then we'll discuss, like, by what date do we want to have, like, someone, found and on the board.
I think we're trying to target mid-November,
Okay.
like that.
All right, so
Do we have our
that's
November
actually
meeting
helpful.
schedule?
We have November 1st in the packet.
So
for
maybe
tonight.
the
So
second meeting in November, and typically, the top one or two candidates might speak to a couple members of the board, so that would be the typical process. And then Alex's article, I think all of you have gotten a copy of it. I don't know if you've received any feedback on the article for the other paper
I don't
in
believe
the board
so.
corner, but that should be submitted by next Thursday, I believe.
Okay.
That'll be on our schedule somewhere. So I would include in that then a link, well, actually, they don't do links. Maybe the, just the web address of where to find the application
Yeah.
for anyone who reads it through that venue, or the fact that there is an application form available.
Exactly.
And
I was thinking of also potentially printing some out and having like a small stack in the main office
That's a great
in case
idea.
people aren't able to print it themselves or didn't get the email.
good. So if there's feedback on Alex's article, if you guys could make sure that you provide that by, say, this weekend or so.
That's great.
All right,
Okay. Thank you.
good.
Thank you, Alex. Nice job.
Yeah, thank you.
One thing we didn't mention was the TIE group, which is our exchange group will be coming from France, and they arrive on the 27th. It's a nice opportunity. There's a fair amount of activities that go on around the TIE. Families host, and then our students again go, and so it's a great opportunity as well.
Great. Good. Any other announcements from board members? All right, seeing none, we'll move on to agenda item 6, the superintendent's report.
So I have two things. I wanted to just make sure the board was up to date regarding the construction around Rick Marcotte. You all received before the construction actually happened. Brent Kuhn and I made sure notification went out to all parents. So you folks are around what was happening at Rick Marcotte. Nothing happening to the school. It was really around the entrance. So when you went in, if you didn't see it on day one and you went in day two, you saw, access into the school from the Market Street is now quite open, and so we have a fair amount of questions that were rolling into to our office around what's going on. Even though we've done a lot of talking about it, I think a lot of people felt like, I don't think it was ever going to happen.
Pretty shocking.
Yeah, right. So in there's some steps that are going to happen regarding, and I put it in my report here, October 9 through 13th, they cleared the debris, 16th through 20th, although I haven't seen them yet do anything with the stumping and the big excavators there, but nothing's happened, but I imagine that will happen in the next day or two, I expect, and then excavating, digging the foundation with the following week, and then all the foundation work begins after that. The reason I'm wanting to just make sure people are aware, we have some pretty significant activity on that piece of property, so fencing will happen, chain link type fencing. This is what they've had before now was just tape, which is shown here, but they're actually going to enclose the whole location because they're going to start to dig, and they'll have all kinds of things that need to be kept away from the general public. So they've been really good. We met with them now on a couple occasions, and they've been providing updates, so that's where we're at. So that's that.
Just, are there any, I mean, you've talked about that being fenced off. Are there any safety or noise issues in terms of disrupting school activities that you're aware of?
So we've asked about, we asked about that, obviously, during the tree clearing process. Chainsaws were running, but it wasn't of significant disruption. I think it's of significant interest to a lot of our students who are watching. Yeah, and so we did say that there could be some fun exchange between the construction happening, how many yards of concrete, how would you estimate, there can be some fun challenges that can happen. We'll see how that goes with the contractor. Obviously, we have work to do, they have work to do, but there could be some interesting factoids that can happen that we think will be pretty good, and they were up for that challenge as well. But as far as other noise, most of what we haven't heard anything about needing to do any blasting or anything. It's mostly very wet soil. Once the trees are up, then I think it's going to be mostly the excavation noise, backing sounds of trucks, things of that nature is what we'll hear. I do think there's going to be some traffic disruptions at times in and out of the entrance, because they're going to be using an entrance. You go into the driveway, and about 60 feet later, they're going to be turning left right into there. So the entrance is here, about 50 feet in. They'll be turning into the property. So there'll be a fair amount of disruption to the driveway. And, also I can envision issues around muddy driveway, tires getting, picking up a lot of mud. So we're going to need to make sure that there's some expectations around just keeping that clear so that people aren't driving, through big mud patches, et cetera.
Was there any discussion of a temporary entrance on the other end?
No, that's on the Mary Street side,
Yeah,
Elizabeth?
yeah.
No, there wasn't. We did ask about that, but this currently, because that's, I think, awaiting other approval.
Right.
What they have, obviously, is they own this entrance, and so that's the current entrance.
So there was nothing, yeah.
Ideally, what I would really like is that they, go over what actually isn't really much of a curb, but that's not the plan currently. So I don't know where they may load the trucks. They may be doing some loading off of here. I'm a little bit worried, and we'll have our next meeting about bike traffic, at least until weather starts getting worse. We may need to, may ask for some coning, so that can be depicted because of the added activity in and out of that driveway. And then the other is just the human resource and financial software. I'm not going to read it to you. Basically, we have a plan to move forward. We absolutely in desperate need because we're going to be discontinued, but at the same time, and I alluded to this, we alluded to it in the motion, that the state actually is in the process of. Now, I say that, we've said this before, but we think they're pretty serious, and we don't want to be out ahead of that if they're then going to be adopting. So we've got a slight pause, and I just wanted to make sure you're aware of that. I don't know, John, anything you want to add to that at all, or not that you have to?
I think the slight pause will be more than a month or two, then to get an idea where the state's going with this. We don't want the state to go one direction and us to go another direction. If they're going to go, we want to go the way they're going. I think, frankly, we're not in a position right now to implement that anyway. We're up to our elbows in health insurance, so we don't mind a month or two break. If this goes on much longer, if it gets into the spring, it's going to be a serious problem for our timeline. But I'm hopeful that we can get the extraneous issues resolved, and we'll have a direction, say by January 1st at the latest.
I'm excited about the option because we've never been able to in the state have a single a plan like this, and that from efficiency and data collection would be huge progress. So.
Quick question. So is there any penalty or anything like that we're facing for not proceeding with the current provider?
No, the current, it's fairly likely, I think, that the state will go with the same vendor that we're thinking of going with.
But if they don't, do we have some financial risk there, or no?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I can't imagine.
The risk for us, the biggest risk for us is that the current system that we have is not going to be maintained into perpetuity. So it's not like we can just sit and wait. We
Was
have to make a decision.
RFP accepted contingent on the state doing something?
We have contacted the state, the vendor, and told them the situation. Of course, they're fully aware of the situation, and they understand, and they're like fine with us, putting this off for a while.
And
And
that
do
was
we
added
know-
into our motion when you passed it,
Okay.
if you remember.
That's what I was trying to recall. And does the state have the same selection criteria that we used?
I haven't read their RFP in detail, but certainly their ends are the same as our ends.
Not our academic,
No, not their academic.
but the end goal.
There's all kinds of ancillary issues with the state running this statewide computer system. And I don't want to get into all those. But I think on the whole, it will be a positive thing. It will probably be more cumbersome to implement because we're kind of in trace with 260 other school districts all going in the same direction. And they've all got their own idea of where this ought to go. But generally, I think the advantages of us all being on the same system, with the state able to dip in and collect whatever data they want to do in the background without us knowing about it, would be an enormous benefit to all the school districts.
Obviously, it'd be protections for us in some areas, but we spend, both state and local spend dollars either trying to aggregate the data to send it, or on the other end, they have to disaggregate it in order to make sense of it. And I think there'll be some fair amount of efficiencies so noted if we can, when we get there, for both.
Well, I mean, I certainly see what the potential advantages would be. I've also seen consolidation efforts where, the district's needs could be compromised by a consolidated solution that sort of addresses
than, yeah.
the common needs of a broader group, but maybe doesn't have the level of specificity we were looking for. But sounds like we'll deal with that when it comes.
Yep.
Good. Any other questions or comments? All right, we'll move on to agenda item 7, the FY 2019 budget.
So what we've provided, and again, I don't think we necessarily want to go through all of this tonight. A lot of you have seen some of the information that's in here, but John and I, at least I came late to the budget advisory. I was with Steve for a moment at the technical advisory committee meeting that started at 5 and left at 4:15 and to join the 6 o'clock budget advisory, and Steve stayed for the rest. So we at the budget advisory provided this exact information, almost, not the bottom kind of budget questions for the board, but went through kind of the timeline expectation of the advisory and went through a lot of the significant issues currently in play as far as the budget process. So I guess I think it would probably be best for me just to pause and listen to what you folks, I would love to be able to come out of this evening with a little bit more direction from board members around some direction you have for me around kind of the end goal, if you will. I don't think it would be wise, not that I would do this, I'd go out and come back with a % increase that would be X, or a tax rate that would be X, and it would be, what are you thinking? I think there should be some conversation and calibration that we talk about tonight. Again, in the packet, as I said, is some of the same information that you've all been provided from AOE through Rebecca Holcomb, through kind of the conditions that are in play. And that said, I think it is important. I know that Rebecca has talked a lot about making significant reductions in staff because of enrollment trend. And I want to be clear that where I'm not wanting to say we're growing exponentially in high percentages, but we're not seeing the same trend that other schools are. That is kind of the context of the message, and which I think she's been communicating. So
Well,
let me listen.
Yeah, I mean, just a quick one on that. I would add a bullet point on this because it's as recent as, I believe, today or yesterday that the secretary had another article out that is calling for reductions in staffing, and it wasn't completely commensurate with enrollment. It had to do with ratios and, Vermont's ratios relative to other states and so forth. So I would definitely add,
Gotcha. That letter.
the reductions in staffing direction from the AOE to the list.
I think the FTE piece, I know that data that I've provided to you in the past, or have kept you, I'm sure that will be a component of what I share with you too in that same venue.
Other board members?
So I guess a couple quick comments, I mean, at this early stage, of course, I would like to see, first of all, I would like to see some reduction in staff, but I mean, that's really hard in the abstract to give much direction on that. But the trend has been in the wrong direction as far as our ratios. I mean, our ratios are not where they should be. And I think with some more advanced planning, perhaps we can figure out that. But as far as, the growth rate and the tax rate, which are intertwined, I mean, what I would like to see early in the process is a level-funded budget and what that looks like, what that's going to entail to get there. And then the budget, taking in consideration that we need to cut some staff, or at least we're hearing that push, the one that you want to proceed with that maintains the education that we're providing here. Maybe they're the same, but probably not, because costs go up. But I think just right off the bat, we should have an idea, we should have that for comparison purposes. Here's what level funded looks like, because there's gonna be a push to have level funded. And here's our ultimate, what the administration would like to have. At least that's my two
We had-
cents.
We had talked about last time, sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
We had talked about, I thought it'd be helpful very early in the process, especially, hopefully it shouldn't be too much work, to provide sort of a run rate budget based on the changes that we already know have happened with the budget as this year, and then changes that we know absolutely need to happen, just so we have a starting point to then do something like what a level funded budget would look like, where that would come from, and then what the ideal budget would be from the administration's perspective as well.
Yeah, I think I'm hearing three scenarios
yeah.
articulated. I don't know if it's useful to have a fourth, which is kind of dramatic. Maybe it's too dramatic to be realistic, but I was trying to struggle with what the 8-cent increase meant, and I think it's like a 5 or 6% tax rate increase. Is that? I mean, I don't know if we can readily translate that into what the implication is, but can we run a level tax rate scenario budget? Not that I think it's something that would be, because it sounds to me like that would be even more draconian than a level funded budget, but just to communicate with the public that, I mean, to condition them, look, given the dramatic increase in the ed fund at the state level, there's almost invariably going to be a tax increase. Because I think we've had tax decreases in 2 or 3 last 2 years. But that just given the pressures that are completely outside of our control. Actually, I think the point was made 5 years ago. We had a pretty low increase in our budget, but there was a 5 or 6% increase in the tax rate. And I just don't know that the general public, certainly I as a member of the general public, did not see those two things as separate. But if we did run a level tax budget, how draconian would that be?
Do you think, one of the things I know I'm sensitive to is sort of the amount of modeling we do prior to actually approving a budget. I'm wondering if we ran, kind of do the service level budget, which we talked about at the last meeting, but if we ran the level funded and looked at what the tax rate would be based on what we know so far around, what the yield rate might be or so forth, that would probably give us a gap between an 8-cent property tax increase and what level funded looks like. So I think we could infer that that's how much lower a level tax rate budget would look like, rather than
Doing one.
I'm just sort of thinking, I think you're right that it will probably be even lower than level funded.
But I would also say on that point that the 8 cents probably is taking into consideration some growth of budgets, historical growth trends. I mean, I don't think that.
It actually isn't. It
isn't.
specifically said in the article that it was
I
not
missed that.
including any programming, no.
All right, well, I missed
Yeah.
that bit. That's unfortunate, okay.
Yeah, sorry.
So this always happens, for us. I think out of the gate, having this direction is really good. But remember, we get more and more clarity as we get more and more details of equalized, and we get yield, or we get some trending towards what the yield's gonna be. And so we have some moving parts around if it's gonna be level fund in a services budget, but then what are the criteria that are kind of feeding that, which kind of lead us to that eventually coming to, an adopted budget. But I think the way we've done it in the past, and I will work with John to articulate that, but our budget worksheet has been a helpful tool that does allow for kind of an in-the-moment, what does this do, what does this do? And it may be that you're hearing different things and you can run those scenarios to help move that. Now, I think an important component of this is how are we going to continue to advance, the academic services to the students, right? And at the same time, how do we maintain the facilities? So in some of these budget issues, obviously, most of what we just talked about, from either the payback, the ideal estimation on the increases, teacher contracts, but there are a couple things in here. I want to highlight a couple of those, and that is, one most important is the bonding on the stewardship capital items. And I would like to get a little bit of, some response from you. And let me first explain my thinking. We, for a long time, have carried our facility stewardship within our operating budget. And when you think about it, if we're putting dollars towards something that's going to be lasting at least, or if not longer than 20 years, it probably shouldn't be on the backs of the taxpayers today. And bonding over a 20-year period does allow for people whom are not all in the tax base today, but it will spread it out over time. So when I think about, our parking lots, when I think about the air handlers, when I think about those bigger items, those are items that are going to last 20 years. So I've at least asked John to begin to think about what items within our stewardship plan over the next 3 to 5 years that could be left justified and looked up about for bonding. But before I go too far, I think this is a concept and a conversation that you need to give me some direction on, like, stay away from it. One of the things that Elizabeth and I have heard is over at the city side, which I don't have a lot of yet clarity, but if the city puts up 3 bonds and we put up 2, the likelihood of any of them passing may be problematic. So let me that's one area that I wanted to also get some feedback in addition to what you've already provided me on budget direction.
Do you have a sense of the dollar amount of projects that you'd be looking at?
I think we could be looking at like $4 to $8 million worth of bondable projects in the next 3 to 5 years. The typical, I think, stewardship load is like $600,000 to $800,000 a year, which is a pretty good nut all by itself. But we've got some bigger items like the HVAC work, we've got some roofing work, we've got the parking lot work. We've got some items that probably are going to have to wait for the mechanical structural study to give us some guidance on. But I think it would be prudent to take that level of items and try to borrow for it. It's one thing to do $300,000, $500,000, $600,000 in your operating budget. It's another thing to try to manage $2 or $3 million in your operating budgets. We did $2.5 million the year before last, and I think it gave us a good leg up on the elevator, the windows, the elevator over here, the ball fields, and, you know, the cost of that, the debt service expense is fairly modest. But I think it is worth taking a look at bonding some of those bigger items.
Another part of that equation is we had the approval from the voters to establish a capital reserve fund, and currently there's $300,000 that sits in it. We didn't want to use it, because if you drain it every year, then it's not a useful fund. If in fact if we were to go to a bond, then I might consider using some of those dollars, or reducing the budget by some of those dollars, by bit, and working to the future to repurpose it a little bit. But again, it probably wouldn't be significant, and I haven't really talked a lot to you about that. But I didn't want to leave that off, because that's a pretty big, conversation, and I'd love some guidance on that.
I mean, I assume you're going through the bond bank for our summer bond issue.
Municipal bond bank.
Right, so I would be, particularly, I mean, also like your feedback, you've had more experience with it, that if you take 2 bites at the apple for 2 or 3 million, or 2 to 4 million, as opposed to 1 bite at the apple for 8 or 10, do you perceive that to be a little easier, and maybe stagger it every couple of years? Because the nice thing about the bond bank is we can go with those relatively small amounts that if we were trying to bond on our own, it would be prohibitively expensive, but because it's a pool. I guess I'd say the other thing is I think the sooner that we get that out in the public discussion, the better. If we start acclimating people now that there's something, potentially coming up, and really put, specific projects and lifetimes, that's probably going to be more favorably received. But and then just the other thing, I mean, the interest rate environment's still fantastic for long-term borrowing. So, yeah, I'd be very favorably disposed.
I get, one question I'd have is, would bonding allow us the opportunity in an operating budget to contribute to the reserve fund?
Right, so you could have some dollars.
We had to forego that last year,
Repurpose.
and that might be something that would be helpful if we have an opportunity on an annual or fiscal year to actually contribute
Repurpose
to
that.
that.
Well, if you're putting 600,000 or 800,000 into your stewardship out of the operating money, your appetite for putting money also into reserve fund is probably pretty slim.
Well,
But
I'm
if you
just
can
thinking, if
About
you
using-
don't have to do the full 600 because you've bonded.
Right, then if you can
then
knock that.
Is there a portion of that you could
Yes,
apply
I
to
think
a
you certainly
reserve?
could. If you could knock that down to 200,000 or 300,000, then you've got 300,000 or 400,000 that you could conceivably add to the reserve fund with.
I mean, fundamentally, this is a bigger conversation, and it probably should be one that we talk about with, VSBA and VSA and legislators. But typically, there's no real specific rules on how we carry stewardship in our budgets. And so when you do the math, when you subtract, out our revenue, you get that cost per pupil. And our budget, we've been a district that's typically carried a fair amount in our operating budget, which others have not. Either they've avoided maintenance or don't have a plan, and therefore that's a very different mathematical equation that goes on around comparing. And I don't know, in some ways, I don't know that, I think we've done a good job. Some can look in certain places and say, we're still behind. When we first started that stewardship plan, I think Elizabeth, you were on, we left justified so many things and we had to reschedule. And we're currently at a place where we're doing pretty well, but we still have some of these bigger items. And I don't really see how we're going to be able to move forward. And I think this is a better idea. So,
I also think that on the flip side, I think we just do need to exercise a little bit of caution because of where we are with master planning and visioning. And so we had discussed this, structural review that's going to happen. And just based on the timeline that we're on, that hasn't started yet. I mean, I think we were talking about tonight, perhaps, getting that started. And there's the potential, and then the second phase of that, which wasn't in this year's budget, is to actually do a needs review for the middle school and the high school, which could then lead to some pretty significant projects that we're talking about for FY20 as opposed to FY19. I'm just a little bit concerned about how big we make a bond, if we do a bond this year, knowing that potentially the year after, there might be something higher priority or more substantial. Or, if, for example, I know one of the things in the back of my mind that, from looking at the stewardship, long-term budget previously was that there was some pretty significant upgrades at the high school that were originally scheduled for this coming fiscal year. And so the question is, should we go ahead and even do those things, or should we reschedule them until after the structural review is done, after the phase 2 is done? Because there might be some pretty significant changes to this building and the high school coming out of those discussions. So it's a little bit of a prioritization game. So I think the sooner we can see like what kind of things we're actually talking about, so we can have a real substantive discussion about this maybe seems like could potentially be in a bond now, or maybe this could wait until we've had the structural review and the phase 2 of that process. I think we just need to
Nice.
sort of start to see some more details. And I don't know, I know it was early days because it was just the first Citizens Budget Advisory Group meeting last night, but I mean, did you get good turnout, and
Oh,
did you
yeah.
start to discuss this kind of
I
topic?
thought we had great turnout, some really interested people, and we had a great conversation about the very issues you're talking about, the MPV and the capital improvement plans. I was really gratified that all of the members from last year returned.
Great.
Plus, we got, I think, 3 more. So it was a real valuable meeting, I think.
Because the year that I was on, before I came on the board, that group actually had a pretty significant, impact in terms of how big the bond was. Because I think originally John Stewart had asked for a $5 million bond based on just what the general 10-year capital improvement plan was. And our group kind of said, there's just not an appetite right now in the community for $5 million, but $2.5 million would get, these major projects and these high priorities done, and then we'll talk about the others over a longer term. So it would be good to start to get feedback from them on concrete projects as
Sure.
well.
So that's great, great information, Bridget. What guidance I gave John, at least in just kind of the quick review of the stewardship plan, was to look at items that were not impacting the high school or middle school, specifically the buildings, because of I would hate to put dollars into something that then, given a future plan, has to be undone. That would be very bothersome to me, even if it's, 5 or 6 years later. But there are enough things currently, at least what we've identified, and we did some sharing with the advisory. We kind of populated that left justified ideas to give them more clarity. And we can certainly, obviously, be doing the same with you. But before, we go too far, I wanted to, is there an appetite for that idea? And if so, then we'll continue to pursue that with the advisory. And through the advisory, through our budget development process, you'll see some of that. Doesn't mean in the end you can say, take it all out. We don't want to do it. But nonetheless, before I go down that road, it would be good. So I'm hearing kind of some favorability to that. I'm hearing some favorability to coming in with looking at kind of a level funded, or services budget, a level funded, and tax rate implications at kind of the 0, what that would be at no increase. And Alex, yes?
Yeah, David, what sort of things could we consider doing to the current year budget, given that next year is going to be painful? Could we try to spread out or perhaps carry forward a surplus into next year by finishing under budget in the current year?
Yeah, we have to be careful about that. We have to, we've generally, in our budgets, had money that we carry forward because, we do run close to a $50 million budget,
Yeah.
and to run it to 0 would be not right.
Right.
But we also say if there is money, we have to, it's part of the process where the electoral group has to make that determination to carry that forward. I think that right now, for responding to you, it's really on me and the administrators and John to be looking at, where we're, and all of our administrators, on FTE ads, being really prudent around, do we need it? Can we find that resource somewhere else? How can we best accommodate currently this year in the best possible way we can? And, we've been working hard to keep down our be watchful of the FTEs and how we do it. At the same time, we also have to be responsive to student needs as well. So I think moving forward, efficiency, FTE, looking at all of those factors to see if we can come up with a budget that's still going to move us forward, that also has some reductions in there.
Well, I've begun to think that, even though we cut this budget twice to get it passed, it might be considered, and we might end up looking back a couple of years from now and considering this to be a very generous and full budget compared to the one that we're gonna have to get passed in about a year. And, to be going up and down, year to year on what we're able to offer it would be nice to smooth it out a little bit,
Yeah.
if at all possible.
Well, there's some, certainly on our end, on what we spend, to the best of our ability, there can be some calibration to that. I do think with a capital reserve fund or a bond that's taking out some of our facility issues, which we've typically carried in our operating budget solely, will give us perhaps some latitude to be really mindful about what those other increases are in the total budget.
Yeah.
And it may be, I think, more palatable for people to say, hey, these are all building issues, kind of the brick and mortar, if you will, and these are the program issues.
Yeah.
And the worry, of course, is you can have a yes and a no, or a no and a yes, and that sometimes can create some problems. But nonetheless, I think it's a viable approach.
Just so you're kind of prepared and thinking about this in my head, the budget scenarios, it seems that there are two that are just pure quantitative exercises. So the one is the level funded budget. So exactly the dollars that we spent this year, what would it look like if we spent the same dollars next year? And clearly that means you're trimming personnel and some other things because of the roll forward. Two would be this current services roll forward, world left to itself budget. Keep everything exactly as it is, but build in the contractually, bargained increases to salaries, healthcare, whatever. So those are two just mechanical, mathematical exercises. I think we were talking about a third budget, which I'd call maybe the ideal world budget. I don't think it's money's no object, but it's sort of like David Young left to his devices to come up with a good scenario. And I think, so level funded's gonna be the lowest dollar amount. The current services roll forward budget's gonna be a higher dollar amount. I'm gonna presume that, an ideal world budget would be even a little bit higher still.
Yep.
Is that about?
It's good, yeah.
I think that's a good starting point, just to frame the best likely, worst likely. Maybe there's a worst likely that's below level funded, but I think that would be pretty tricky.
Very helpful.
There's always a worse,
I think the level tax rate for next year is the one that would be the lowest.
It draconian,
More
and
than
that's why I'm
likely.
But we're
wondering,
saying we're not necessarily.
is it
gonna-
draconian to the point of not useful for the
Yeah,
discussion?
okay.
I just don't know.
I mean, it could be level funded minus $164,000 take back. I mean, that's as likely as.
So I had a couple of quick things before we wrap up here. One is, we did reduce the budget last year, prior to getting it approved by the voters, by 1.2 million. So I think we do need to go back and kind of reconcile where that 1.2 million, when is some of it rolling forward? Is all of it rolling forward? How are we looking at what we cut out of the budget in terms of this coming budget year? We also had, because of timing and so forth, we had a number of different positions, for instance, that hit at different times. So just kind of a reconciliation of the current year's budget, and that may address some of the issue you're talking about, Alex, of a potential surplus. I think we may get some guidance on the use of reserves based on what's happening. The reduction in or the use of reserves last year in terms of the ed fund is what's contributing to that 8-cent property tax potential increase. And I think we just need to sort of understand how we want to fund reserves, if there's going to be guidance on that. I also think last year we got quite a bit of feedback from the community on sort of the top line spending versus the tax impact. So recognizing that right out of the gate, let's make sure we're addressing that. I also think being clear about fixed versus variable costs is important. And then clarity on both the contribution and cost of tuition students as a subset. That was another area that we got community feedback on. There may be others as well. And then I sent some information out to the board. I had a chance to participate in a program at Champlain College on the Vermont State employees and Vermont State teachers' retirement funding system. And there was a panel discussion of folks that were kind of, the sky is falling, and a group that, I think the alternative to the sky was falling was kind of, yes, we have issues, but we're moving in the right direction. We just don't know if we'll get there. So it's like the sky may be falling. But I did send out information to the board, but the order of magnitude specific to teachers' retirement and retiree health care is the unfunded liability for each of those is about 1.8 billion right now. So the total is 3.6 billion within that group. Right now, individual school districts don't have an obligation to fund that liability except in the form of new employees, where there is a new employee incremental contribution to the pension fund. And while we're not aware of any action by the legislature at this point, I do think it is becoming a point of discussion in terms of the current pension benefit as well as retiree health care benefit, and that funding gap. We know we have, about 30% of our educators are kind of at that high-end master's level and are moving through their career. Interestingly enough, one of the things that came out at this conference was that some employers, not just in this sector, but offer early retirement incentives, and they said that actually can backfire when it comes to pension payouts, because you basically put a bolus more of people into that system and tax it even further when it's underfunded. So this is an area I think, even though it's not budgeted locally, ultimately I think Vermont state taxpayers and South Burlington and our school district are both contributing to, I won't even call it a liability, it's a commitment right now that's being made vis-a-vis the retirement pension as well as the retiree health care benefit. And we just need to keep that on our radar screen and also be aware that that liability may transition to a local level. It started to
It
a little
started
bit.
with $8 million that was transferred over to the ed fund.
I'm sorry, it's,
$8 million of the
there was a
annual
transfer to
payments.
the ed fund of the annual
Amount.
contribution to the
Right.
retiree
And I assume
fund.
that's going to be ongoing and probably is going to grow.
Well, and that is actually, I don't even know if that's, Martin, the actuarial number, because there have been legislative decisions not to fund that at the proposed or recommended level. So some of the gap we have is due to that not being funded. And we have that discussion at a local level relative to the support staff pension, because we have to make decisions about the level you fund it at. And when you go through a recession, which arguably may be coming again in the future at some point, maybe that's a little bit like saying my estate planning is to not die.
Yeah.
But at any rate, I thought it was good information and kind of timely, and it's something locally we should all make an effort to be aware of.
Just one real quick point for the new board members to understand that the pension that we are handling locally, 2 cycles, I think it was 2 cycles ago with the staff, we moved to a support staff to a defined contribution instead of a defined benefit for, but grandfathered folks who were already in there. So we've made a move in the right direction to deal with this long-term for what we're managing. That, of course, is not what's happening at the state for the teachers' pension.
Which is kind of unfortunate that some of the same thinking isn't maybe going to happen,
Right.
Moving forward, or should be. Well, this is good. I don't know I appreciate the feedback and some direction. And again, as John said, we had a really good meeting. We had SBBA reps were there as well, so we had invited them. There was 2, and then another folk joined us as well. What we have said is that if somebody else, so if you know other people that would like to join it, we're saying that they could join in at the second meeting, but after the second meeting, they can certainly come and be in the audience. But as far as the educating them, helping to understand kind of the financial issues and implications, we don't want to get to meeting 4 and have new people and have to say, time out, we got to back you up and we got to explain. So if there is folks out there that would like to join, then we would welcome them to the second meeting. And the next meeting, John, is, do you have it off the top of your head?
Should be on this timeline.
Yep, there you go. Thank you.
November 18th or something like that.
Yeah, so
November 13th.
November 13, right, 6 o'clock, and we're up in room 213. And certainly, board members, if you wanted to stop in, you certainly can do that too. I know that's not really the intent, but if you wanted to stop in and say hello, you know, that's certainly always welcome as well.
Can I ask one more question before we move on from budget to, which is, or it's more of a comment. I liked last year at the outset, the stuff that we had at the outset in terms of the way information was presented, in terms of the new additions to the budget, and that whole matrix with priorities and all of that. I really liked the discussions that pulled out. I didn't always agree, as you know, on all the priorities, but it was helpful to hear the thinking behind all the different things that were potentially being added into what we're calling
Great.
the ideal budget or the hoped-for budget. So I don't know if there's been any thought about how that information is going to be presented, but I just wanted to give the feedback that last year, that sort of spreadsheet, again, I didn't almost agree with how things were categorized, but the categories and all of that was helpful for me to kind of be able to very quickly see, and then the backup for the priorities and some more explanation of the different things that you were hoping to add into the budget for the following year was very helpful.
Great,
Yeah, I
thank
think the whole presentation towards the end should be the template for how we should be going out to the public as well.
Any comments from the public? Wendell?
On the budget?
Yes.
I actually can't comment on something else, but I had a lot more information than that made me late.
Yeah.
Okay, is it on our agenda?
It's not. I'll just have to wait.
Well, he did miss the, you came in after we had comments from the public
Right,
regarding
right.
items
Yeah.
not on the agenda.
I was getting a lot more information at that moment.
Okay.
All right, so we'll move on to agenda item 8,
Mhm.
master planning and visioning.
So this is also in your book. I don't, if you've had a chance to look at it. So again, I'm trying to stay consistent to the charge and which we're moving forward. I know I've given some brief updates in each of the categories, enrollments and demographic forecast. And again, I have John Stewart helping me on some of these pieces, and I appreciate Bridget coming in and working with John. As you know, we had preliminary information that came from McGibbon, the demographer, and prior to even that happening, we asked to meet with him, and we wanted to make sure that we were getting clarity around some of the kind of the inputs and considerations that were being put into those. So we've received the preliminary. We won't get the final, though, until all of our enrollment information is in. So we go between now and in November, mid-November, in that collection of that census of students, and then that will conclude their information gathering, and then we'll get that report. But I think, again, and I can let you, Bridget, speak a little bit to that if you wish.
Yeah, no, a couple of pieces of information from my discussions with John. Really, John was sort of just updating me on additional analysis he had done after he received the report. And we sort of talked through some of the high-level summary points in the report. The one that really stuck with me is that we're expected to add another 131 students over the next 5 years. The next 5 years after that, the projection is to lose about 65 of those students, but still we're expected to net about 65 or 70 students over the next 10 years. So it's much more of a sort of holding steady or, you know, slight increase, if you will, over time, as opposed to a declining scenario. One of the points that John Stewart sort of mentioned to me is that in his work, David and his work with McGibbon, they had sort of said, you know, there was something that didn't smell right even in the previous report. So the old report from Master Planning and Visioning, the original one, McGibbon went back and found that he sort of had a mistake in one of his calculations. And so that has been corrected in, you know, his whole model. And so he really has a lot more confidence, supposedly, in these numbers than the previous numbers. So those are some interesting points from our discussions with John. And then, you know, as David said, we're just sort of waiting to get the average daily membership numbers to the state, and that will be sort of the final input before we get a final report from McGibbon. But it sounds like he's sort of taking into account, and I don't know if he did in the previous Master Planning and Visioning one, but the the more recent one, he is taking into account things like the new builds that are going on in South Burlington and really trying to get a few more local factors into the model than it felt like there might have been in the previous model. So I have to say I'm feeling a little bit more comfortable with where we're going with this one than I was with the previous one.
Thank you, Bridget. So number 2 was the noise testing, and because of just our desire to get more clarity as a school district around testing and sound testing, this is, while at the same time we're looking for data from the airport, or the updating of the sound testing. ATC is a provider that is looking to provide that, so we've asked them. We've paid them $3,000. They'll come back with some very specific bid specifications, which we then can bid out or choose not to then get some clarity and testing done on the inside-outside noise levels at Chamberlain. This could go along at the same time when other testing may or may not be done, but that's kind of where we are currently. We've sent that, and we hope to have that information back in front of you for the November meeting, November 15th meeting. Item 3 is correspondence with the international airport, and that is that we did ask for some specific information, and a result of some of the receipt of that was also recognizing that they'd like to have us part of the technical advisory committee meeting. And so at one of our previous board meetings, Steve, I don't know if Steve was here, maybe he got selected when he wasn't here, I don't know. But, or maybe in one of our master planning groups, but Steve is our representative at the technical advisory meeting, and it happened last night. I was there, as I said earlier, for about 45 minutes before coming to the budget advisory, but maybe Steve, can you give a quick little snippet of?
Yeah, no, the meeting was held at the airport. It's called the Technical Advisory Committee, or TAC, and that is a component of this noise control plan, which further lives under the Code of Federal Regulations, and it's I was actually trying to find the exact description, but basically there's going to be a change in patterns of operations at the airport, so that's what's driving this. And just some of the organizations that were involved, by my count, there are about 20 that are members of this committee, including the Army Guard, the Air Guard, the FAA, several industrial development corporations, the towns of South Burlington, Winooski, Essex, and Williston, South Burlington School District, Winooski School District, and then Community College of Vermont and St. Michael's College. So I think that's just about everybody. And some other towns were invited, and I don't know if they're intending to participate. But basically, this is, as part of this plan, this is a vehicle for the community to provide input. It's advisory only, and they're going to, tentatively are holding 5 meetings. This was the first, and the next one is tentatively December 5th. And then they're looking for a 3rd meeting in January, a 4th in March, and then the 5th is TBD if needed. But the 2nd and 3rd meetings are where they're going to start to talk about things like resources available for sound insulation and or purchase assistance. And Chamberlain School does figure large in the planning. So more to come on that. Otherwise, this meeting was very much, informational in nature. They're circulating a working draft of the report, but it's really just like table of contents at this point. But then their plan seems to be to have iterations of this report provided at each of the subsequent meetings. So I'll keep everybody posted. I mean, obviously, it's, the main question in my mind is, are there funds available in some way or another for Chamberlain? So.
We've definitely indicated to the airport or the FAA that we're interested in sound mitigation. So that clearly came through in the communication yesterday, although just beginning, but recognition that locations like the school are in the queue or in the process of the development of that plan. So that's the advisory component, and I think that again, as Steve said, we'll keep you posted around that. I'm kind of repetitive on the advisory committee because it's intertwined in a lot of the kind of the noise assessments, et cetera. So, anyway, I don't know if there's any particular questions on where we are with the sound testing or with the advisory.
I guess I don't specifically have a question about those. It sounds like they're in a good process. I guess my question is, what we're planning to do or what we're thinking about doing outside of just the testing of the levels of noise, because the whole idea and the way the resolutions were written was really to see not only what the levels of noise are, but what impact they're having, if any, on the educational opportunities and the health of the students at Chamberlain. And I don't think that's something that's gonna come out of any of these pieces that are in process. So I don't know that we've really, had a lot of discussion yet about how to really go about getting some kind of baseline about where the students are at Chamberlain and in their educational and sort of health outcomes at this baseline. So
I think that's fair. That kind of walks into the, how we're going to, at least my hope is to pull all of this together for the board, for those of you that are helping me specifically on master planning, as kind of in subcommittees. But the decision making matrix that we previously talked about, although we need to put some additional shape to it. But when we look at cost, when we look at, noise, when we look at disruption, when we look at outcomes, when we look at the factors that are identified in the master planning criteria that you set, the hope will be is that we'll be able to say, in each one of those components, is it kind of in a 1 to 5 scale, no concern to high concern, and to be able to walk down through those and say individually, I don't see this based on the data you're presenting, David, and group. That's a big concern, or it is quite a concern because of the data that we're getting back. And when you add all those factors in, does it prompt you to be in a place where we need to be making some decisions? I kind of went through this morning at the SBBA meeting, which was at the airport, and the F-35s, the first F-35 is going to come in September of 19. So when you kind of do the, we're currently in obviously the 17-18 budget and planning for the 18-19 budget, and then that very next September, a new aircraft comes. And again, just on the premise of noise, if it arrives and and we haven't gotten all of the concluding data beforehand, then we're in a that's our decision point. So trying to work kind of backwards. Not only that, I don't want to say that it's only the noise issue, but working backwards from some of those known entities, and it could be cost because we do know how we're running the school, Chamberlain versus the other two. So what I'm trying to articulate is a decision-making, my word matrix, I don't know what you might call it, but allowing you folks, as you get information, then you'll be able to start to, I think, articulate where you feel you are.
But my question is really, are we going to have the data for a key piece of that, which is the outcomes? I guess my question is, right now these are sort of long processes, and is there another parallel process that needs to be going on, some kind of health study or some kind of in-depth look at the actual impact? Because I'm a little worried that we'll get to the end and we'll have great information on what the noise is, but we'll be left guessing whether or not that noise actually has a significant impact. And I understand what you're talking about with all the different, the 5 different or 6 different factors we'll be using to make our decision. But I feel like a little bit concerned that we won't actually have any kind of real data to tie that decision to when it comes to this actual student outcome.
And I think we want to pull the academic and the student outcome data in there. We've done already a preliminary on the cost per pupil spending. We did that quite a bit ago. But we do need to do kind of a comparison of outcomes. In I guess our other test groups similarly would be our other elementary schools to look at outcomes that are happening. And one would be able to say, has there been any significant change based on noise, based on other factors? And I think that's what we owe you. We owe you kind of some of that information specific to student outcomes, along with, where we're running on budget, where we're running on, other related factors.
I was going to say, maybe if this is helpful, so I'm looking at item 2, which is the noise level testing, and then item 4, the technical advisory committee. With respect to item 4, so this the concept by which sound insulation would be conveyed, as I understand, would be in exchange for what's called an avigation easement. So basically, we allow the airport all of its operations, change in light levels. I mean, not that we're going to be using the school at night, but they're just sort of all sorts of operating parameters that we basically provide an easement to them to go ahead and do in exchange for the consideration. I think that that is regardless. So if that's available to us, and if it's available to us at no cost, that's probably, I mean, something that we'd like regardless, just, because there's already noise at the school. If we can get some sort of remediation, that's good. But I think number two then is, we were talking about getting a quantifiable baseline as to how it is now, so that when the F-35 comes in and it's like, boy, does that louder? Does it seem louder? Does it not seem louder? Well, then you run some more testing and you've got two comparable data sets. I like the idea, and I don't know that we've contemplated this, educational outcomes, and I'd say health outcomes, but you do have some very general parameters at different levels of decibel noise, so at like 65, well, that's traffic, that's generally no long-term damage. But if we're talking about, I mean, now I'm going to pull numbers out of the air, but if, we're regularly getting occurrences of 100 decibels on Chamberlain's Playground, that's going to be a new set of circumstances. And so I think that, I mean, at some point, it's not even educational outcomes, it's just health.
Well, and that's my point, and that was the point I was getting to, and maybe I should have been clear. So at some point earlier in this process, we had been approached by some state agency who had said, we'd love to do a public health study of all the schools in South Burlington. Their time frame, the parameters of what they were going to look at weren't appropriate for us. It was going to end up being more of a time sink for us, really, I think, is what we kind of came to, then it would be advantageous to us. So I'm not saying that specific way of going about it, but is there somebody else that we need to be reaching out to on a public health, from a public health perspective? Or, as what we're saying, we feel like we know enough about, if we know that there's this level of sound, then we have enough information to make some kind of decision about what the likely health impact is. Do we feel confident? I don't feel confident personally that I know enough about levels of noise and all of that and their health impacts in a quantifiable way.
Right.
Obviously, more sound, bad, but in terms of a quantifiable potential outcome on students' health and education, is there somebody else that we need to be reaching out to run a parallel process that says, if the data comes out at this level, this is what you can be expecting, or this is what the likely impact is to students. If it comes out at this higher level, this is, so I'm just not sure that any of us are capable of actually doing that calibration of once we actually have hard numbers about the noise and what the potential remediation would reduce that noise to. I just feel like we need some kind of help in order to figure that out. Maybe others don't feel the same way, but I'm
No,
just
I
concerned
agree,
that we're going to
Bridget.
be missing a piece of the puzzle when we get
The
there.
question for David is, does this vendor, does ATC
Right.
provide that corresponding? So, we have measured, we've done extensive testing at various locations inside the building and outside the building. We've done the average, noise contour, but we've also done specific, we watch a jet take off. And I was actually at the Harvest Festival this Saturday, and the F-16s were doing full operations. And I mean, it's loud. I mean, it's, when you're kind of standing out there on the playground and in the athletic fields, so, but I'm expecting that we will have a large amount of data, quantified decibels and whatever other measures. And remember, David, at some session several months back, you actually went through about 20 different metrics, noise metrics, like 1 minute exposures and 24-hour exposures, what have you. So if we can get a really good, robust data set, and then compare that to the new operations, and if you see a 20 or 30 decibel increase, I guess that's what I'm saying is, do you then need this consultant to say, okay, a certain decibel level, you aren't going to expect any permanent effects. At these decibel levels, in 1 minute, you're going to cause permanent, those are the types of things.
Yeah.
Will you also, it would be one thing to just get the numbers, and I think it would be another thing, and I don't know if this vendor can do this, can also opine, this will cause damage, and this will cause this type of damage.
So I think, to your point, Bridget, thanks for re-clarifying. I feel the approval of the board to have that second set of kind of data collection, ATC, they're going to put together the specifications. We'll then go out to a vendor that will give us, and my hope will be significantly provide us with, kind of the health-related data.
Okay.
We may still need to go a little bit deeper, but I don't know. I think we're in a really good position because we aren't simply waiting for another EIS study to be done, which we don't really know when. We don't know when the modeling will happen, and I think we're in a good place to be able to have, as you said, Steve, kind of some quantifiable comparative data that will be important. Fundamentally for me, one thing that's really, really important, and I'm still, again, and I know this is a public meeting, I'm really concerned that there's not transparency around contours. And I'm not a sound person, but contours, all contour lines that we currently have seen to date have been the DNL contour. And I think a lot of people just think that that's the nomenclature for the contour line. That is the 24-hour day-night noise level average. And I have become more and more, just concerned, and this, we'd like to know kind of
Events.
what are the events that make up that 24-hour contour. And if all of that is important, I think, to our community, but for us during the school hours, what are those incidental?
Yeah, it's a
Yeah,
school day
school day
contour,
You said if it's
yes.
during recess, or and it can't be mitigated, and the sound levels are, and then we put the F-35 or new aircraft data, that's important data. And again, we're not talking about whether we like or don't like we're talking about, the noise and our children, right?
Let me see if I can be succinct about this. So with respect to number 4, I think it is those DNL contours that are directly tied to and trigger those navigation easements. I don't think that those have any use whatsoever related to number
That's
2,
right.
like 1-minute intervals
Right.
or single
Right.
incident exposures. That's a whole different data set. So it could be the case, and probably likely the case, that regardless of what we're doing on number 2, we may want to pursue navigation easements under number 4.
right.
And regardless of what kind of, whether it's sound insulation, whether it's purchase assistance, whatever, regardless of what we have under number 4, and if we're completely unsuccessful, we may still want to pursue remediation or removal from Chamberlain as a result of what we find out under number 2.
I do want to make one point of, clarity, is that we did ask the airport for the data. They gave us back the data, which I believe comprises the compilation of the 24-hour day-night noise level. And that's been given to ATC to use that as well of kind of looking at their next model.
So a couple questions. I know we've talked about having subcommittees, and Bridget and Steve and I are in some form on these subcommittees. But it seems to me that it would make sense to have 2 of us, look at what we get back from ATC and explore this issue of health and academic outcomes a little bit further, talk about what data might be available, talk about whether we need to bring in a statistician to help us out or some other person. I know Bridget just has been explaining a lot of interest in this, but I'm happy to work with Steve since you're working on the demographic issue. But I'm also happy if just the 2 of you meet. It doesn't matter either way to me. But I think when we get back whatever ATC is going to provide us, that would be kind of the point to meet as a subcommittee. And I'm also going to suggest that we decide on which 2 people should be on the subcommittee for the school contingency plan. I don't know if we've nailed that down. I mean, that could be you and me, and I could work
Yeah.
with Steve on the other one.
The truth is, I feel like you have some background on the
Yes.
Chamberlain issues and the airport issues, and you would probably be a better partner for Steve on that issue. And I just feel more comfortable, frankly, on the contingency planning issue and the budgeting and all of that kind of stuff than I do the airport noise,
So Steve and I we should plan, once we have something back from ATC, to sit down as a subcommittee to talk about these issues a little bit further, if that sounds.
So Martin, you and I are number 2,
2 and 4, essentially, 2, 3, 4, I guess, essentially.
Okay.
Those are all the airport noise
and
ones.
Bridget, you're number 5. Okay.
Yeah, and I'll
Sort
work
of
with
1 and
Bridget
5,
on
yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Works for me.
Great. I don't know if there's other questions from the audience either. And this is, again, a big topic. I know there's a lot of people probably wanting to know more and having
I don't think
conversations.
you've gone over number 5 yet, have you?
No, I was trying to just give a little pause for the other day.
I thought
I
you
think
were
we've got a
moving
big-
on. I thought you were trying to
No,
move on.
might have been
before I-
smart. But- So, we'll move on to 5 then. Not that I wanted to forget it. So, I think one of the other components is, that's having a contingency plan, which was identified in kind of step 3 for our work. And again, I think this is important that we get it out. Although when I say these things, I want to make certain that these are not hard fast. These are coming up with some suggestions. I don't want to, elevate high level of anxiety, but I think it's important for people to know that, we have to develop a contingency plan. And as I said to you earlier, looking at kind of the year we're in with the arrival of the F-35 as a noise-making aircraft, coming in September of 19, and then I think not much thereafter, the rest of the fleet will come, which will be a total of 16. So when we look at this, prioritizing kind of some of the work and looking at alternatives to date, some of the conversations have been framed around these options, and obviously construction of a new school on a new location. And a lot of this is time sensitive, which is right out of the gate could be problematic. Again, add addition to brick and mortar for additional classroom space. Adding a modular or temporary or portable classrooms to locations which would be in the present, under this particular scenario, to Rick Marcotte in Orchard, and or occupy already currently available space that's underutilized that we could lease. So that's kind of out of the gate, looking at, and part of the reason I brought up that timeline is because it kind of provides a very clear picture, I think, of like, I'm going to just say some level of high anxiety, and I think the least portable classrooms can be an appropriate opportunity, but it's an expense that I think is not necessarily the best use of taxpayer dollars. It's a short term. When I say short term, it can be used for a long term. Some schools have used them for a long term, but the return on your investment is not great. And so then it becomes questionable on whether or not you should just be doing some brick and mortar addition. But at the same time, if we don't know our configurations for the future, particularly what we might be doing on 2 campuses, then it becomes further complex. So I put this out here because it's part of, I think, the expectation. December is the deadline that we have for some contingency conversation, but it's going to be tightly wound into the budget. And there's going to have to be some things in here that I think begin to have some significance to the budget.
So, I mean, maybe soon is the time to talk a little further about these dates. These dates were set before we changed the Rebels name, before we had 2 budget defeats, before we had the negotiations and where that ended. And these were all things that, yeah, perhaps we could have predicted, but I mean, I think I'd rather not have it rushed so that's December 31st. I'd rather have it done right if we push it off a little bit, given all the things that have happened. Maybe that's something we put in for action next time if folks agree with that concept, that is.
I think what you could say to me or us, we could agree on that it should be factored into the current development of the budget.
Well, sure.
And in some cases, I think that would be most important, because part of the budget development is looking at our current plan, looking at where we are with our schools. And I think as we begin to populate some more data, whether it's coming from the airport work, the ATC work, enrollment data, et cetera, we'll start to see a little bit more, I think, clarity around what might be the best recommended option. And currently, while I say, portable classrooms, that wouldn't need to be factored into the upcoming budget, but it would likely need to be in the queue for the following year, because right out of the gate, you're going to have to, prior to, over the summer, you're going to have to get portables hooked up and ready if that was the case for the arrival so you can be prepared. So that doesn't give you a lot of time, and that's, so there's a lot of moving parts to that equation. So I think it should just be factored in. I was feeling like it's fine to be kind of associated in with kind of the budget development process, and we'd be talking about this kind of connected to that future work.
I would, though, I agree with Martin, that I would like us to, at some point, take action on actually formally changing the dates, so that we still have some kind of time frame.
Sure.
Because it's easy for it to just kind of take on a life of its own and just kind of be out there. And I think it might be good, I don't know who should be responsible for the overall timelining of this, but sort of some estimate of when ATC might come back. So these are guesses right now in terms of when we're going to actually have all the data to populate it, but we can start to think about what the realistic timeline would be for understanding where we would be with Chamberlain, and just sort of trying to get some grasp on what
That's
a
good.
realistic date for each of these
I think that's
is.
fair. I think it's likely the advisory group is going to get some more concrete information and dates, about when we saw it actually in the handout. There's some specific dates in there. ATC, we can get from them when some of the deliverables are going to happen, and we'll be in control of how that's worded in the bid response. And I think similarly, you then can set what you want for the contingency plan.
For the contingency plan. And then I think for number one, the identify the specific needs for the high school and middle school, we're pretty significantly off of that one as well in terms of the timeline that was laid out, because, we still are about to approve, I hope, this structural study, and we haven't even really approved phase 2, which would, technically have to happen in next year's budget because it wasn't approved for this year's budget. So it's certainly not going to be finished by June 30th if we're talking about next year's budget. I think we need to start to think about what the realistic dates are and then maybe take action on that.
So
Great.
we can look at either we've got it November 1st, and I think we have a November 15th meeting.
Yeah.
So maybe either of those two meetings.
Great, thanks for
Any
the,
other comments from the board or the public on master planning and visioning?
Well, the only question is whether, I didn't know if we had any place else on here with regard to, it's the bids. Okay, it's back in the bids section, the consent agenda. Okay, fine. I just wanted to make sure that we weren't skipping over that
Bridget.
part,
Yep.
yes, because I know I was the one who delayed that last time, so I just wanted to make sure that we were on top of it this time.
Yep.
Okay.
And I just checked with David, and assuming the board is okay with this, we added an 8A VSBA resolutions. I'm going to add another brief public comment section after 8A and prior to getting into policy review on Agenda 9, if everybody's okay with that.
That's good.
All right. So we'll move on to 8A VSBA resolutions.
Want to chat about this? So, at a meeting earlier or last month, at some point, decided that I would be the designee for the board at the VSBA meeting tomorrow, and we'll be voting on behalf of the board. And I've kind of taken that as, all right, you're trusting my judgment on these things, but I want a little bit more than that. And I have gotten input from Bridget on the various proposals, but I did want to run through them and just explain them very briefly and get any additional input from you all as far as how I intend to vote. But the thing is that at these meetings, these can get amended on the floor, and the language can be changed a little bit. So, I need a little flexibility, so it's not going into this. The first one, committee proposal number 1, I'm not going to go through the background and whereas, just to explain what the resolution is, which will be actually in our resolutions. And just to back up for a moment, what this does is it provides guidance to the VSBA to advocate on behalf of the members of the member school boards, either at the Agency of Education or the legislature or the executive office. So that's why these resolutions are there. It's just to give some guidelines to our representatives there. So in any event, the first one is VSBA supports legislation authorizing the creation of innovation zones to exempt supervisory unions and/or districts from specific regulation and policy in order to create models of world-class education systems that can be scaled across the state. Just very quickly, this one is not very controversial. I mean, unless there's something, I mean, I was on the resolution committee, so I've heard back and forth of the pros and cons of some of these. I would suggest that, you know, that I'm gonna be voting yes on that unless there's some sort of substantial change. I don't know if there's any input on that one.
Well, what's the specific legislation that they're talking about?
There isn't specific legislation. It is, there may be, there's one of two things. They're either going to be advocating proactively on one of these issues to try to get legislation. More likely in the coming session, it's kind of reactive. It's what position are we telling the VSBA folks to take when they go to the legislature or the Agency of Education if this is an issue that is moving in the legislature. I don't believe there's any specific legislation, although there are interests, you know, certainly the chair, at least of the House Education Committee, is interested in trying to improve how the technical schools operate and try to exempt them. I don't know, unfortunately, I don't know the details of this one.
Is this one a real priority for
No.
members?
No, it's not a real, I mean, it's something of interest certainly, and it's fairly narrow in the times. There were a couple particular instances where this could have been used. I'm sorry, I'm not gonna be able to tell you those. Wasn't even in Chittenden County, and something was held up by some certain regulations.
Yeah, it just,
it-
I mean,
it's-
in
it's
looking
pretty-
at it, it just doesn't seem that material that it would.
It's not material for us, but for some other members, they do wanna have some guidance on that.
You know, this is your
Yeah, no, but no, if
VSBA.
you-
You know, again, my concern is that, you know, we've struggled with choice opportunities, which you could conclude that choice is innovation opportunities for students to be able to go to different locations and different schools or different settings. I mean, I worry about, you know, these are my cautions. I worry about kind of the unfunded mandate, that if this innovation happens and they're excluded from some of the state regulatory components, that then where does that liability rest? So, I mean, these are just a little bit of the red flags that go up, and currently, you know, we're fairly regulated right now, and we're working hard to implement regulated things that I just worry about putting another layer on. I love innovation, but what does that really mean? I would much rather see us do some, you know, review of what are we looking for opportunities for all kids, and making sure there's an inventory versus just trying to come up with a different program. But I like the concept. I worry about the implementation, and I worry about the cost.
So these should be read in the context of the current resolutions that are already continuing in place. And there are resolutions regarding unfunded mandates, saying, no, we don't like those and you shouldn't have any, and regarding choice and independent schools, which I think covers the concerns that you've raised. Those are legitimate concerns, but those are covered in other pre-existing
Fine.
resolutions, so.
Good.
Yeah, and I mean, just my very high-level view of this is, how can you exempt districts and SUs from regulation and policy, and then have models that can be scaled across the state? To me, it's counterintuitive, not that you, I mean, the assumption is here that without regulation or policy, there could be some other model out there that would be scalable, and this one just doesn't resonate with me at all.
Right, well, I mean, part of it is to have, you know, what we're trying to also have, on the one hand, you have scalable, and on the other hand, you have some flexibility to have alternative pathways for students, and this is what this is to try to provide, is what was my understanding. It's not something that is necessarily being sought to be scalable, because it's handling some unique situations that are preventing us from providing the full gamut of opportunities for some of these kids. That was kind of the basis, as I understood it.
Well,
in the
it
conversation.
specifically says, in order to create models that can be scaled across the state. That's what
Yeah.
but, yeah, I mean, you know it better than I do, so I'll trust your judgment on it.
Well, I mean, I will hear also
Yeah,
the
what
debate,
the
and if
arguments
there's
are,
big
yeah.
problems with it. My inclination, again, is to vote yes. I didn't find anything very controversial, but
Yeah.
as we learned there, and if you're there and elbow me, and I can adjust. All right, the second one is a little more controversial, and it's in order to ensure equity and sustainability in the healthcare benefits available to all school employees, the General Assembly should adopt a process for the negotiation of healthcare benefits at the state level by a council of school board members to apply to contracts that expire in 2019. The purpose in this is in part to provide the VSBA a position that they can be going into this commission, which is already happening, and also to advocate one way or another. My personal feeling hasn't changed since I voted against this earlier this year as a legislator, and I've had conversations, and I know that Bridget can speak for herself on this. I have a problem with this one, and my intention would be to vote no on this. Despite the fact that negotiations are difficult, just the one that we've just ended now, there was give and take among, between what we were offering in the health insurance and what we were offering with respect to salaries and such. I mean, what we had on the table with respect to health insurance, in our view, increased the disposable income and justified in part what we were doing with salary. And I don't want to see that taken away from the local bargaining. So my intention is in fact to vote no on this particular one. The rest of them I'll tell you in advance, I'm planning on voting along with this. But I would like input from you all. Change my mind, if you will. I know you don't want to negotiate, you want to send it to the state, or no? Is that, yeah? Yeah, I'm happy to hear that, because things will be fluid on this one tomorrow morning.
Steve?
Can I go ahead? So, well, and again, typically my mantra is private candor, public support, but we got to debate this one in public.
Yeah,
No,
absolutely.
actually, I
No, that's fine.
strongly support moving it to the state.
Okay.
And number one is just scale. So, we, I think, particularly given some of the specific expertise of some of the members of the board, kind of have the capacity to understand the nuances of the contract and negotiate favorable terms. But I think, the issue that's replicated so many times over the state is so many school boards are completely overmatched in this area. And so my sense would be, it may or may not be the case that a statewide negotiated plan would be slightly less favorable than one we have, but I think on average it would be vastly better than what is replicated around the state. Number two is the state faces the liability that's a consequence of the negotiations. I mean, I know that there is, I guess, a single state teachers retirement system benefit that's negotiated at the state level. Bridget, or Elizabeth, you're going to have to correct me on this, but because the state is financially liable for both the pensions and the health care, I think there is some alignment in having the health care benefits negotiated at the state. Now,
You did just hear me mention the unfunded liability, right, of 3.6 billion?
right. Yeah, no, that's what I'm saying. It's completely unfunded. We put $0 towards the OPEB trust. So, yeah, and I mean, that's because the plan is still open. That is just an exploding liability. So, yeah, what I'm saying is maybe, of course, you maybe also have some risk of agency capture. I don't know. But my general sense is that at the state level, we would probably have better capacity to negotiate the plans. You'd probably have a better staffed negotiating team. I mean, I definitely want to see what that negotiating team looks like, but I just think that would be a better outcome. Salaries you could still do locally, but healthcare, because you are talking about a uniform retiree healthcare benefit at the state level, a uniform pension benefit at the state level, I see no reason why you wouldn't deliver healthcare uniformly at the state level.
If there was going to be a different funding stream to deal with that at the state level, that would be one of my issues that I have, that they're foisting whatever and maybe one administration is going to do very well in the negotiation at statewide level. I don't have confidence that a future administration may have the same view as the current one with an 80-20 share and the like. So I'm still more comfortable in instead trying to improve how we are doing collective bargaining at the local level, and that's one of the other resolutions in here, and it does match up with a bill that I'm introducing in the legislature, and providing continuing training to the local boards as opposed to taking it away from the local boards. So, I mean, that's kind of where I am with this particular one, and I'd love to hear other folks, Alex, Bridget.
Okay. Sure, I'm open to the idea. In my view, it's a balance between local control versus economy of scale and predictability. And I think with the way the discussion has been, where people have been talking about, well, some people talk about a statewide teacher contract. I oppose that, but having a statewide health insurance contract, I think would be beneficial. And not just from a negotiating perspective, but I think in making negotiations easier, yes, but also making the outcomes more predictable and allowing people to, I guess you could say, plan their careers in education. So I think I'm with Steve on this. I think it's worth putting in a resolution. I'm not at the point where I'm going to say, okay, I'll vote for this legislation and not know what the impact is, because if we were hit with legislation that says, okay, here's the statewide teachers contract, all the other school districts that have their statewide health insurance contract, all the other school districts, that is null and void, and the statewide contract for health insurance for teachers takes over. I couldn't vote on that. I'd have to hear a lot about that. But as far as a resolution in favor of it, I think it's important to keep the conversation going.
Well, I mean, the conversation's going to be going regardless of what this resolution
yeah.
is, number one. The economies of scale is what is achieved through VHI. I don't see where the economies of scale are actually being achieved through taking this to a state level. And it's completely, in my view, contrary to the fact that we continue to get upset about unfunded mandates and things coming from the state and losing, we're losing local control on various issues. Sending this part of the negotiation to the state, it may have some benefits. I agree with what you're saying. It may have some benefits, particularly with the current administration, as far as where we might end up with the negotiation. Although that's not even completely clear to me. So I mean, I just have a basic reluctance to give up any more of our local control, and this is an important aspect of it.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, no, please.
In terms of unfunded mandates, I mean, we have the pension, and I don't know if you want to call that an unfunded mandate or not, but I would underfunded mandate, but I would consider it that. But on the pension side, the pension is something that needs to be funded, but you also need to have a certain amount of reserve for future usage of it. But in health insurance, I don't know if you would call it a reserve, but you're basically collecting premium for claims that are going to be paid within that particular year. So how can you explain to me how you would have an unfunded mandate by a statewide health insurance contract for teachers? I just don't understand that.
Well, if through their statewide negotiations, they come up with a 1585 share and $400 on the out-of-pocket total or something.
Yeah.
I mean, that to me would be, they're foisting on to me whatever they're not able to get the NEA on a statewide basis, and agency capture is a huge concern with respect to that at the state level. Then that means that we're having to pick that up, and we had no control over that. And our local community members who are voting on our budget had no control over that. And that's what bothers me. And I do think, back to your issue, I do think the agency capture may not be important right now in the administration, but if we establish this now going forward, it could very well be.
I can't
So-
argue with you on that.
So, any event, Bridget or Elizabeth, I would be delighted to hear both of you as far as your
I'm
view on this.
completely in agreement with you. I think this needs to stay at the local level. I think it's one of two actual levers that we have in negotiations, and I think a lot of all the school districts have sort of come to their own conclusions about where they want to, set those levers. And there's going to be a huge, I mean, this isn't the only reason, but because there's going to be a huge adjustment, and sort of a mess created in people's salary levels and all the things that they've negotiated with their local unions based on whatever's handed down from the state. Some people, I think, probably, not a lot, but I think we might have even done better, without some guideline from the state. I mean, everyone kind of snapped to that guideline, even just with a guideline, and let alone being told that this is what you have to put in place in terms of healthcare. And I think that actually complicated our negotiations. I don't think it makes negotiations easier to take healthcare out. It takes issues off the table, but I think it gives you less room to actually negotiate with your staff. And I think that is a core principle of negotiations, that you're negotiating with your employer, and to sort of have that taken up to a state level where it's subject to state level politics and all that, I'm just very uncomfortable with that. And I just don't buy the argument that state level people are going to have a better background to do this. I just don't think that's necessarily true, given some of the calculations or lack of forethought we've seen in some of the things that have been handed down to us from the state level. I don't think that the state level is always better and is always going to have the best team to be making decisions about this. I think letting school boards who may have some ability to negotiate hard on some of these issues set comparables, basically, I think might be more effective than having someone at the state level sort of sitting there with a spreadsheet and deciding that this is what it should be for every school district across the state. So I'm just not ready. I just haven't seen evidence that is going to lead to a better outcome for us or for all school districts. So I'm just not ready to support the
Watch a
VSB.
phenomenon here. It was about 5 minutes, and I'm sorry to leave you hanging, Alex, but I think you've changed my mind, at least to. No, I mean, now that I think about it, because I also just think about what spilled out of my mouth, I said, well, first of all, I don't know that I had correctly thought through that by virtue of VHI, we already get the volume discount.
Yeah.
And I don't know what VHI's successor will be, should VHI not be here, but can we presume that there will continue to be a state-level delivery of active teacher healthcare, or a state consolidated delivery of active teacher healthcare? So that point I get, and then it really is down to what's the premium split, what's the mechanism, like you said, it's reducible to basically a compensation question. And that is a bargaining lever. And then I also realized that I made a comment, I believe, and I still believe, that on average, a state-level negotiated contract probably would do better than the median Vermont school district negotiating teams do.
Right.
But you're right about agency capture. I'll just say it flatly, you get a progressive administration in there, and they may give, they may be much more favorably disposed to the other side
Right.
in setting the benefits.
Right.
And ultimately, as a school board member, my first fiduciary duty is to the South Burlington School Board, not the state, or to the South Burlington School District and South Burlington taxpayers. And I do believe that we probably have the expertise to negotiate better terms than the median terms. So that causes me to change my mind, Alex. Sorry.
Well, let
Good
me
job,
just-
Bridget and
well-
Martin.
Well, let me just add two things.
Towel being thrown in.
And just to add two items. One, again, I think the goal is to put all those lower than the median school boards in a better position with respect to negotiating. And the VSBA is already undertaking that. And I'm hoping that collective bargaining guidelines are changed in this coming legislature to even the playing field. But the other thing is we haven't talked about the staff and how this is being looked at as this one size fits all. And we have a very different situation with our staff and what we do with health insurance and how that fits into our negotiations. And I'm more concerned about what would happen with what we're doing with our staff than actually with our teachers. So that's just another issue that I have out there. Haven't heard from Elizabeth, but, I mean, if you want to weigh in, I mean, I think,
Yeah, I mean, you know, part of this discussion, I think, was driven at whether Martin would submit this board's position on a resolution, or whether I would step up, because it would be a conflict in terms for you, based on your position from a legislative standpoint, or not a conflict, but just a concern. You know, my own feeling is, I do think, Alex, to your point, to kind of acquiesce or see this part of compensation, I think it's, you know, you hear the argument of slippery slope. I think the potential to end up with a statewide teacher's contract at some point becomes higher if this is off the table, if healthcare's off the table. I also look at, you know, I look at it in terms of the variables. You know, I look at the new plans that are being introduced January 1st. You know, there's been a long run with the current VHP dual option plan, and that's been a virtually no deductible plan, significantly high premium, largely borne by the employer, and the state's never had an interest. And so the new plans have created this. I think the guidance that came out on the premium split and the out-of-pocket expense component of that, as well as the timing. I mean, as we all know, the healthcare recapture is heavily weighted for this particular fiscal year, when budgets are already in place and when those plans are only going to be in effect for 6 months. So there's no claims data for these new plans. There's no recapture. The emphasis was on an HRA, which is an employer-funded model. So, I mean, I think we've seen a little insight as to how the state might manage this, and I'm not impressed. That's on the record now.
I think that's in fact fine. I
have one more point, though, to add. And it's looking at the two primary drivers, and there's a list of about 6, but the two primary drivers of premium increases are just medical and pharmaceutical inflation in general, and the second one is utilization. And that is an area that, if I look at the state's ability to really get a large base of employees and their dependents involved in improving utilization through training and education, I think that's a really tough, tough nut to crack. And I would like to think that we can engage, better locally in that effort. I probably don't have the same strong opinion that you have, Martin, but today, to make it a priority at the annual VSBA meeting, I'd say I would not support that resolution.
And I do think of the guidelines that came out tied our hands. $1,200 maximum out of pocket. We were looking at $1,725.
And the real
should've been
number was
$1,600.
$1,600. Yeah.
And
Yep.
they put us in a position where it was essentially impossible to
Very
get
difficult.
to that. So, in any event. You rethinking, Alex, or you?
No, but I
Okay,
do have
all
a
right.
comment.
Okay.
I do want to point out that I think we're a little unprepared for this conversation, especially in having, in one moment, feeling strongly about it, and then
fair.
in
Fair enough.
a few minutes later, changing your mind. And congratulations to you, Bridget, on being so persuasive. So I think, I feel like, as a board, we're a little unprepared to take an opinion on that. So I guess all I can say now is, being in the 1 to 4 minority, if you would just, in your conversations tomorrow, mention that this was not a unanimous
Sure. No, I understand.
vote
But-
on this.
But
I think
also,
I was going to say, it's also a reflection of the resolution process for the VSBA on an annual basis. I mean, one, we've talked about the timing of these being discussed by board, so we do need more time as a board. And this is one annual meeting, so this can come up again.
Yep.
And, I mean, who knows, the rest of the membership may prioritize it, so.
Yeah, I mean, we can perhaps blame my duck hunting because this was going to be, I think a few weeks ago, I talked about wanting to have this on the agenda in advance, and I didn't notice that it wasn't on the agenda until essentially today. So I apologize that I wasn't here last meeting to make sure it got onto to this agenda. But you're absolutely right, Alex. I mean, I'm in a little bit of a bind because it is tomorrow that is that. So, all right, that one, and the rest of them I will run through, and they're fairly straightforward because it's mainly providing it's efforts to provide guidance to school boards on various issues. So the next one, the resolution is that VSBA recommends the creation of a stakeholder task force to explore the advantages and disadvantages of establishing a state-funded initiative in support of early or on-time retirement. The important point here are the conditions. 2 conditions of a district's participation in the initiative would be a commitment to meet staff to student ratio targets by reducing total personnel through the retirement program, and a commitment to sustain those savings through future budgeting processes. In other words, we're not trying to get somebody to retire to just backfill that position. It's to get somebody to retire to downsize the staff. And that's the key there. And I know that you had a concern, I think, before this was changed in this manner. I had talked to Bridget in advance of the resolutions committee meeting, and I know you had a problem with this one, but we specifically added this points of, I mean, it's fine to have somebody retire if you're not filling them with somebody that's gonna cost $50,000. You send them out on 60% of their
Right.
salary, and then you bring in another teacher, but that's not the point. This is to help school districts downsize, is the purpose of this now. I don't know if that still.
But see, my concern though really is that I don't know that retirements or a backlog of retirements is really the problem in terms of downsizing or people's inability to downsize the student-teacher ratios. My concern is that we're looking at the high-level ratio without understanding the cause. Like, the real investigation should be, why are the student-teacher ratios so high? And I don't think it's because we're just sitting on a bunch of retirees that we can't get rid of. And, seriously, that's not what I think is the problem. The problem, I think, is these unfunded mandates, these increasing demands on school districts to provide more and more and more and more services.
Including social
and
services.
until we get to the bottom of those issues, I think this discussion about trying to set targets is a little bit dangerous for some school districts, because you end up setting up this debate between, like actual educational programming versus, special programming or social services or other things that are being mandated by the state, and it becomes an either or. And, in some places people are really clear about that. Other places people I think are in danger of sort of slashing and burning just to try to get to a ratio and try to meet some kind of incentive for more state money, for this retirement program or other things, without really understanding why those ratios are getting out of whack. I don't think that in a lot of cases, I could be wrong, I don't have a view on the whole state. I can speak for our own district. I don't think our ratio is where it is because we're being sloppy about adding staff where we don't need them. We're adding staff because we're kind of told you have to. If a student meets certain criteria, they have to have a person on them, and so you have to go out and hire that staff. And so, I don't know, I just think the focus of these two together are just not correct. This high-level focus on just the ratio as opposed to the underlying causes of the ratio. I think if you just start setting targets and then expecting school districts to figure it out, I think you're going to end up seeing cuts to educational programs to try to meet those ratios and those targets, because you sort of have this mandated nut that you're sitting on before you can do the things that are sort of what I would call, enrichment to academic programming.
So
That's just my
No,
concern
no,
reading the way
those-
these are worded.
Those are great concerns.
Yeah.
And I did skip over one, which you picked up on, the resolution, a separate resolution that policymakers should convene a task force to establish staff to equalize pupil
target ratios for specific categories of schools and school district configurations and develop recommended strategies for districts to help them meet targets. So, a couple points on this, and I appreciate those are absolutely legitimate concerns, is this is trying to give, particularly that first one, is trying to give some marching orders or some sideboards for our representatives at the State House. This is an issue that's going to be coming up. And we want them to have some guidelines to be engaged in that. And their idea is to not foist some legislative ratio that I guess the House Education Committee tries to figure out for a few months, as opposed to having a task force of experts to come up with recommendations, not something mandated. So
Right.
so it's not
I
like
see
a
the nuance.
lesser,
I
it's not like
I
a
see the
lesser
nuance,
of
yes.
two evils, but it kind of somewhat is. It's like, this is gonna be discussed. Here's how we would like you to try to steer it. Get a task force, get it to be recommendations. That's kind of the same with the retirement component. So that's in fact why I'm supporting this, is that it does give them how, it gives Nicole Mason, Emily Simmons, what we want them to be essentially saying when these things come up. And it's not to go push these. We are anticipating these various issues coming up, and here's how we want you to approach it. So, I mean, I would suggest that, that I go ahead and vote yes on those two to give those appropriate guidance. If there's something more you want me to bring up, to try to further
I mean, I think
constrict it.
Bridget's right. I would share the concerns that this is focused on kind of a numbers game. And I know this came up in the discussion of, if you just change the ratio by, 0.2%, you save this amount of money. But I think we run the risk of that's exactly what happened on the healthcare piece, and has turned into, a $500,000 recapture charge between over an 18-month period for this district, let alone the rest of the state. So I think without focusing on the underlying services component and programming component, I worry that the ratios become just a math exercise.
Right. And that's, I don't think that's the intent, having had a lot of discussion
Well,
with.
the good thing is this is viewed as a task force and a study, so it's not a specific action.
Right. But I mean, I will plan on bringing those points up, both on both number 2 and number 3.
I think in your proposal one, or in the proposal one, where you talk about innovation centers and you talk about world-class education, those are looking towards more specific, desired outcomes. And yet then the change to kind of looking at just the per pupil, you can see there's a kind of contradiction in that, you're talking about staffing and ratios, which goes in juxtaposition to the proposal one, which is essentially creating innovation centers, which if you're going to do that, you're probably going to be adding staff to make those innovation opportunities happen. So
Yeah, that could very well
I think I agree with what was shared from Bridget and Elizabeth. I think there's a behind story that really needs to get captured around what is it you're trying to provide. It should be the lead to the conversation versus the back end ratio only. And so I think being cognizant of what we're trying to achieve, whether that's world-class education, and what are some of those parameters, and how do we then back into to arriving at it, is really an important component.
And if there's any best practices component that could be, added to, the way the task force or anybody's looking at it in terms of, I'm sure there are districts that are doing better in terms of ratios, and you could look at what their outcomes are. Hopefully their outcomes wouldn't be significantly worse. But if there are best practices, where those can be replicated in terms of, for example, we're working on, in this district, on treating students with trauma issues in a different way, in the hopes that eventually, long-term, that might be a way of reducing the number of one-on-one adult relationships that we need with each of those kids. And are there other things that have been done or are being done in different areas around the state that's something that could be helpful in terms of, this is how this district's managed to get its ratio, in line, or this specific ratio of, support staff to students. Because I think sometimes things get buried in this overall 4-point-something number, and, they could actually have reasonably large class sizes, but because there's so much support staff, added on, that number gets buried. And so if there are best practices around certain types of staff or the way different districts are structured that can be shared, that would be helpful, as opposed to just this overall focus on that 4-point-something number.
Yeah, and I think, part of the purpose for these is to be giving school boards a tool so they have some explanation of what is best practice, like you say, for staff, or the best staff to student ratio in a certain scenario. It is giving us a tool, frankly, to question the administration as part of our job of doing our due diligence. That's why it's recommendations. That's why we're trying in these resolutions to help boards do their job, and that's why, I wouldn't agree if this was any kind of mandate, and they're trying to avoid that, because we don't want mandates from the state, but we would like help. Tell me what other schools are doing and what is a reasonable staff, because I don't know. I trust David, and we're doing a good job here, but it would be nice to have a little information that I could use for due diligence to question. And that's kind of the purpose for this, and
Makes sense.
particularly number 2.
Yeah, the other quick component, which I brought up before on number 3, is, this sort of looks at the local operating budget, but does not take into account the fact that with an early retirement program, there is the potential impact on further widening the gap of the underfunded pension and retirement health care benefits. So to not understand the impact of that total financial capture is really important. And even Beth Pierce has said, I think there was a early retirement program offered at the state employee level that completely backfired because so many people took it that it basically accelerated a bolus of folks that were pulling from the retirement fund, and it was already underfunded.
On this one, give me the, to react to this one, all of them are gonna have a lot of conversation. And I could go either way on this, given what I'm hearing. There has to be some discretion given to me on this, unless you really.
The idea of convening stakeholders, immediately my mind went to, as long as the state treasurer is on that committee, the costs to the pension plan will be articulated, and then it can be waived. So I'm fine if it's a group.
If they're trying to strengthen this in some manner beyond what this is, then I would be looking to vote no on such a move. So, all right, the next one is the General Assembly should modify 16 VSA 2007 to require neutral fact finders to consider only a statutory list of legitimate measures. Yes.
Yes,
Thank
yes,
you.
and yes.
Hang on, here. This is like a king.
Oh, yeah, that's not gonna be in the final resolution, so nice. Yeah, that one right there is my bill, I anticipate, or part of it, actually only part of it. The final one is in light of goals of affordability, transparency, and accountability, the VSBA will work with the Agency of Education, the Vermont Superintendents Association, and the Vermont Association of School Business Officials to establish guidelines on the appropriate amounts and uses of reserve funds and the treatment of budget surplus amounts. Guidelines should support best practices and amounts of establishment of and utilization of reserve funds. This one very much is also in place because this is going to be talked about at the legislature, and we want those legislators to keep their noses out of our business, but give us guidelines through appropriate task force. Roll it down. All right.
Good.
I'm good with that one.
Okay.
Thank you very much for helping me with that guidance and such.
Thank you.
Thank you
All
for
right.
representing us, yes.
We will open up briefly for, before we get to agenda item 9, for a brief public comment section for items that were not covered at the beginning of our agenda.
Thank you. I know a whole lot more than I did at the time I expected to comment to. I was somewhat disappointed at what I was reading in the newspaper when I got back from out west. and I felt that you had kind of caved. But I know more of the details. I never myself ever thought seriously of imposing finality, not because I was against it, but because I thought it was a strategically bad move. I now understand more about your strategy. And even as I was reading and I thought about some things in your contract, I said, okay, I hope that you had perhaps a better plan moving forward, and it didn't look like you had a plan. However, perhaps you had more of a plan than I thought you did. And I even realized that in the abstract, but I and many other people from the outside, it didn't appear like you had one. I would like to say, though, going forward, your salary scale is not sustainable. You moved strongly to make it more sustainable, and then, again, from the outside, it looked like you kind of dumped it, made a slight reset. But interestingly enough, when you first imposed, one of the first things that came out of the union's mouth was a strong implication that you introduce sexism or gender bias into your contract, and nothing could have been farther from the truth. If you found that was statistically there, I'm convinced you would eliminate it as fast as you could. You might even get union support on that. If you found racism in it, you would eliminate it. But if you look at your salary schedule, and look at it statistically, the number, or a major factor in what you pay individual staff members, maybe the major factor, is simply based on the year they were born. And that is ageism in my mind. And I question the ethics of it, and from my point of view, it is certainly not sustainable. Young teachers today, I think, have to get more education to even qualify to be teachers than those who are in the upper levels. College has astronomically gone up, the cost of it, compared with other things in society, most other things. And students are coming out with high debt. Who is going to prepare for a career that they know they won't get a decent salary to help manage that debt until they've been around for 10 years or something? You've got people making this and people making half of this. They're doing the same exact job. And there is no evidence that one is doing better than the other. There's no evidence that this person is more loyal than this person. It simply means this person wasn't born early enough to prove their loyalty, whatever that means. So I urge you to keep your eye on the ball on this and do not forget it. There is projection of teacher shortage around the country in the very near future, and it's already hitting part of the area, part of the country. So that's my comment. I will make one more though. So far I'm watching by far the best school board meeting I've ever watched.
We wanted to step up. We wanted to step up our game for you, Wendell. No, thank you for those comments. We appreciate it. And I don't know if any board members have comments or not, but
I don't disagree with your comments, Wendell. I mean,
all right, thanks. All right, we'll move on to agenda item 9, policy review.
So this policy is F5, it's prevention of harassment, hazing, and bullying. This is one of the ones that we're in need of updating. It's a first reading. I think given the hour that we're in, I would recommend that maybe board members take some time to read it on your own and maybe provide us with feedback. We'll bring it back to the next board meeting. Again, I have staff, Stuart being one, that we're trying to get our policies up to date. We have a cycle. We'll have a cycle in front of you that will be coming for first reading and second reading and third reading for approval to get us back up to speed, given kind of the busy time that we've had previously. So that would be my recommendation, Elizabeth. I don't know.
Yeah, and just so the board is aware, I did request whether or not we could get reported data for a 2 to 4 year period on bullying and harassment, notably in the middle and high schools. And I did get a response, I think it's at your places, that that information would be provided at the November 1st school board meeting. So that would be consistent with a second reading.
so I just had some kind of proofreading type things. I'll just give it to you.
That'd be
we don't need
perfect.
to go over it.
Great, thank you.
Yeah,
Martin.
I have proofreading and I have a few substantive comments, but I can just provide them and they can be in questions for next time so people know what they were. It's fine.
Perfect.
Same here.
Thank you.
All right, so we'll move on to agenda item 10. We have 2 executive limitations policy monitoring reports, 2.4 financial conditions and activities, and 2.3 treatment of community, that are both warned for action.
So, however you wish to go through them, typically,
Did we review this one already here?
you
2.4?
have reviewed this one before. Let me hold on that. I don't think they have reviewed
I
this
was
one.
gonna say, it
No.
seemed new to me.
2.4, no.
Unless
Two-
it was really
Yeah,
long ago.
Sorry, Elizabeth. No, because I know that we did some work on this one here, just John and I, to change it up. So this is first. This is, you've not read this.
So typically, you highlight changes in here, so maybe we could focus on any place you've highlighted a
Yep.
change.
So, John, you want to walk them through that?
I don't
We didn't,
think we
I don't
have.
know if
we didn't do the
I've
overstrike.
They've changed here. I think there were probably too many of them to highlight.
So
It's
maybe
all
we should-
updated numbers. It's all updated numbers.
It's all a
Yeah.
lot of updated
Yeah.
numbers. There's 10 detailed policies. The first one is that we're not supposed to expend more funds that have been received or budgeted in the fiscal year to date. And that's complicated a little bit every year by the fact that we generally spend down surplus to some extent. We use the previous year's fund balance to offset tax revenues. So that the, say in the general fund position on page, it's actually page 2, the net change in fund balance went down by $377,000, but we had actually planned to spend $791,000 of fund balance. So the fact that the actual did not go down more than the budgeted fund balance use means we didn't spend all the revenues and budget that we had available.
Yeah,
It's
I
convoluted
I
language.
understand it's convoluted. This last sentence, though, under evidence, under point number 1, this meaning FY16 revenues exceeded FY16 expenditures.
Oh, it should be 17.
Other way, yeah,
Oh, no, this is 16.
It's
Yeah,
16.
16, yep.
No, I find that.
confusing.
I find it confusing, and if it's someone else reading it, like, I understand it after lots of discussion, it doesn't seem quite upfront. The truth is, you just need to have either another clarifying sentence that says, if you include this, budgeted drawdown in the revenue. But if I were just a layperson reading this, I'd say, no, that's not quite right, because you look down here and you say revenues are 46.9 and expenditures are 47.3. So it just means that expenditures were not as high as they were expected to be, or that revenues other than the drawdown were higher than they were expected to be, or some
Revenues
combination.
other than the drawdown were higher than they were expected to be.
Yes.
Yeah, I think,
So David and I talked about this subject, and I redid this section to try to make it more clear, and I wasn't happy with the way I ended up with it, frankly. And I'm not really sure how to make it much better. So if you'd like, I'll go back at it again, but the fact is, we received about $400,000 more than we anticipated, than we expended. When you take into account the $791,000 drawdown that was planned.
yeah. One thing I see about section number 1 is it prohibits expending more funds than have been received or budgeted. So if you look at the received, you could say that we're under it because we have the
Yes.
carry forward.
Right.
But over the budgeted, we're not there. But we have one or the other, and the policy just says that we have
Allows
to have
either.
one or the other.
Right.
And we've got one of them.
Right.
So we're okay on this policy if you want to look at it as kind of an either-or computer programming logic point of view.
I
I'm
didn't
not-
write these policies. I think it is confusing, but I think we met the policy.
I'm not sure we shouldn't be reporting, though, based on both of those variables. So to say, that we met the criteria based on revenues received, but we're over budget.
Yeah, I mean, it would be helpful to say, here's what expenditures were supposed to be, and here's what they actually ended up being. And here's what revenues were supposed to be, and here's what they actually ended up being. And
So
I
you
would
have
say
them comparable
revenues,
that way.
yeah. And I would say revenues without the drawdown, so surplus, excluding the surplus, so that we can get a sense of how well we did in terms of our budgeting and then our performance versus the budget. Because this is, it's confusing to me even after reading it a few times.
Yep.
We can work on
We
it some
we
more.
can rework that. I could keep going through this if there's other things we might find, or we could stop here.
Is there anything else you would call out as sort of meeting that same criteria of the remaining 9?
The only thing I'd like to highlight is the fact that we do talk about a similar issue for the unaudited year-end of 17.
Which number is that? Because I had a comment on number 3 if you're going past.
Yeah, I had a comment on 3.
Why don't we just keep going, John?
Yeah,
Can you just let's just go through them and then we'll make note of the corrections, so.
Any questions on detail policy 2 from the board? Move on to detail policy 3.
Great.
Use any long-term reserves?
Just under number 3,
Mhm.
the foundation, there was the money raised for the Spirit Fund.
Oh,
like
right.
$5,000, and it
Mhm.
was spent down. I think that should probably
Should
be
include
noted in there.
Mhm.
Okay. We did mention the support staff retirement fund. That grew pretty well this past year, so I think we'll be in better shape unfunded liability-wise than we were at the previous year end. District policy 4, we don't do anything in terms of interfund transfers except what are budgeted and to meet the cash flow needs of the day-to-day operations.
Can I ask a quick question on that?
Sure.
Which, so the Munson Field Fund, which now has a positive balance and we've paid off the foundation, is that money being earmarked for anything? Is that?
Well, it's earmarked for maintenance. It's got criteria in it that helps to defer some of those costs.
Are we kind of trying to build that up to the point where we can put in restrooms? Is that a final
Well,
goal there, or?
We're
is it-
trying to have the money so we can sustain the field is ideally what we're trying to do.
So not
So
necessarily.
with
for
rental
restrooms,
and mostly this is rental that happens, so.
or- Okay, thanks.
On post policies 3 and 4, I think it would be really helpful to just have a list, it doesn't even have to have numbers necessarily next to it, but a list of what the funds are, because it doesn't feel like the lists are necessarily complete, and I'm having trouble sort of matching up what's in the list with what's in the exhibits, because it looks like in the, like in Exhibit 5, it looks like maybe non-major special revenue funds or proprietary funds might include some of these ones in number 4. It's unclear in number 4 why just these enterprise funds are included and whether there are other funds. It just doesn't feel quite complete, and it would just be helpful to have sort of a checklist of the long-term reserves, where they lie, in terms of the balance sheet, and then for detail policy 4, which funds are potentially, covered by this policy. Because we just keep focusing on the enterprise funds, it almost feels like we might be missing some. Even if it's just to say that we didn't do any transfers from them, it's just helpful to see what they are.
Yeah, what other ones might be there?
Yeah.
So we can look. These are the ones that we're,
Well, because it says, one of these, I can't remember if it's 3 or 4, refers to, I'm trying to think which one refers to Exhibit 5, but then the fund names that are in here don't match up with what's in Exhibit 5 on the balance sheet itself. So just sort of, it's just not exactly clear if that's the
Okay.
evidence for that specific detail policy. It's just hard to match up the evidence with what's in the writing.
Okay. Try to clarify that.
Yeah.
Detail policy 5, failed to settle payroll and debts in a timely manner. We'll state that all payroll dates were made on time, and we paid no late fees during the entire year that were presented to us. The detail policy 6, don't allow tax payments or other government-ordered payments or filings to be overdue or inaccurately filed. We did submit a table here that shows an exhaustive list of different reports that we're required to file, and they're all posted on time. Detail policy 7, we're not supposed to make a single unbudgeted purchase or commitment of greater than $25,000 in addition of a .5 teacher. And we did add some staff during the 17 year, and each one of those was brought before the board for approval. And we did make the addition of a contingency teacher in the FY18 year. That was brought before the board for approval. Spending of surplus, again, we've got the same issue that we had in the first detail policy, and we have the same conclusion that we did not do that from basically the same detail. Detail policy 9, fail to pursue aggressively receivables. Schools Out program has been a problem in this area, but I think we're making great progress in that. We brought a small number, I'd say, of bad debts to the board last spring and had them approved for write-off, but the rest of the collections are proceeding well after we hired the additional bookkeeper. Except non-resident tuition students, unless tuition is being paid by other Vermont school districts, we do no longer engage in those kind of transactions. At least what we said was that in light of the fact that all the detail policies were in compliance, the overall policy should be found in compliance. So, and we can go back and try to clarify some of the questions there.
There's one tiny typo at the bottom of page 9, the avoidance, I think you want of financial jeopardy in the superintendent's interpretation. There's just a word missing.
Could be of.
Yeah,
Yep.
Thanks, Bridget.
since we're going back anyway.
So we'll go back and work that a little bit more.
Yep. Thank you.
All right, and 2.3, treatment of community.
I don't
Looks like
remember
there are
if we.
some changes here.
Yeah, there are changes. I think this is the first time you're seeing it too.
I think so too. One question I had in this first part, we keep talking about the wellness guidelines, the wellness procedures, the wellness policy. It's a little confusing in here yeah, it's a small thing, but whether it's technically guidelines or policy or procedure, or maybe it is correct in each of these different places and there are 3 different things, but
So maybe
it's
just check the
confusing.
wellness
Yeah.
policy versus wellness procedure.
I thought in general we had too much on the master planning and visioning in here, too much detail. Because it started to feel like we were getting into this very, very specifics of master planning and visioning resolutions and the work that we were doing on them. I thought we could probably cut a lot of that out and just say that, we passed some resolutions and we envision that there's gonna be more community input into the process, as we determine the needs at the high school and the middle school, and as we determine a plan for the elementary schools, or something to that effect. It just felt like we were getting very detailed. I started to mark up the master planning visioning, and I was like, wait, why am I doing that? Because this just feels like too much.
All right, so we'll look at that.
Yeah,
I was-
and to go, sorry, go ahead.
I was just trying to, capture some of the specifics that we had previously talked about in this particular, as it was, I thought, important evidence to including, our constituency in the process. So just giving some, but it doesn't need to be that elaborate.
Well, my main concern was that a lot of these places, a lot of the work that we're doing right this instant doesn't actually include a lot of public input. It's really, right now, we're kind of in data gathering mode, and that's why I was thinking
So
it would actually be
I'll
clear
modify.
just to,
It's fair.
Yeah, I felt similarly about all the reference to wellness, and I think the PTOs are a community subset at the facility level, but I think almost that's the point, is just to say that PTOs exist at each of the facilities, and support activities that might be plays or
Yeah, so it's a-
events like that, but I think
Too
referencing the
much
district
emphasis.
policy on wellness doesn't seem consistent with 2.3 to me.
Okay.
well, it's interesting too, because a lot of the feedback I've gotten from community, just anecdotally, on the wellness policies, they didn't feel like they had input on that, and from people who participate in PTO activities, there is some
Yeah.
frustration about how strict those guidelines are and what it means to some of the PTO activities and how they've changed. So it's not exactly great evidence of how we're really
Yeah.
including the community necessarily.
Got it.
So, with respect to input into school matters, just to make clear in this, there's obviously was a lot of, quite a few disgruntled community members who felt that they were not given a sufficient opportunity to give input on the name change from Rebel's name, including with respect to the petition. The key, though, is that angst was aimed more at the school board, certainly the petition. I mean, that's not subject to this particular monitoring report, which is the superintendent's performance, not the board's. So I don't think anything needs to be mentioned regarding the petition, but you may want to mention something in here as far as the community, the opportunity input to the administration that was provided with respect to the name change. Even though, again, that was ultimately a decision that the board made, it was subject to input given, the recommendation. It was upholding the recommendation that you had made. I think that can't just be left there silent.
Yeah, I mean, I think the emphasis there is twofold. One is appropriate input, and sort of what constitutes, significant decisions or use of facilities, I guess significant decisions, because to me, what I would document in that regard is sort of the number of agendas that had public discussion.
Right.
The access, the number of emails received. I mean, I think we've documented this in the past.
Well, and the input that the administration received before making a recommendation to the board.
Right.
Because you did outline that, as did Patrick Burke. Both of you outlined that to us as part of your recommendation. And I just think that should be reiterated here.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, just taking a shot at, when you look at, my interpretation was to, what steps have I taken to provide inclusion, of our constituencies? It wasn't necessarily, I didn't view this as like having to be precision, but it just, there were some steps that indicated, that supported that I'm complying with the policy around involving the community and treatment of the community. So steps that I've taken are to include but not conclusive or not complete.
Well, I think,
Now, why are you, sorry, go ahead.
no,
I'm just saying, why are you excluding the board from this? Because
Well-
aren't we held accountable to the same policy?
no, this is
The
the superintendent shall not fail to do these
But I-
things. We have our own, we can go back and look at how we've done with that by looking at the component of the policy that relates to us and our
Right.
obligations that which we have.
But
on this.
Yeah, in regard to that, though, like, for instance, where would you include the Facebook communication and other paper articles? And, I mean, isn't that all part of an overall district inclusion of the community?
Well, it is, but again, it's not subject to this monitoring report, which is specifically looking just at the superintendent. And when we're talking about all the communications what we should look at is opportunity for input on the budget. I think that was run by the superintendent. It was to us as well, but the board meetings are also getting information into the superintendent. But the superintendent, the administration gets information from the community outside of these board meetings. And I think it's just, and I'm not saying that you have to be, covering everything, but I think if somebody in the community sees this who was upset about the Rebels name, it's like this, what do you mean input? This is all you're talking about, input? You didn't listen to me. I disagree with that viewpoint. I think that there was plenty of opportunities for input on that issue, and I think that needs to be laid out here.
Fair, I can add.
Yeah, look at
Makes
the recommendation you did.
Agendas, there's some kind of bulleted areas here that can be, what are those other steps that can be included? Other actions that can be included. Yeah. Got it.
And I also think, you know, you've had a few instances this year where you've really had to enforce the procedure around access to facilities. So there have been a lot of folks who have complied with is it a procedure on access? And some that either chose not to or did not. But there's no exclusion if, you know, if there's compliance with procedures relative to access. And I think maybe mentioning that there's been consistent
Actions.
enforcement of that type of thing. Any other board comments?
This is a small one under input into school matters. We're talking about the citizens budget group. It says will be revived again this year. Kind of makes it sound like it's not been active.
That's good,
It's
revive.
been working hard for a few years. I would just say convened again this year to sort of give the impression
Revive
that
is
it's ongoing and, yeah.
Thanks. All right, great. Thanks.
Any other comments on 2.3, treatment of community?
The last one was this, improvements have occurred in the hiring process, including updated job descriptions, which have been posted to the Human Resources website and revised hiring guidelines. I was confused about how that was inclusion of the community.
Well, again, I just think that the community is wanting to be informed around how we operate and what we do. Hiring is a component of that. And, you know, that there is opportunity for people then, because we're public, they can offer, you know, suggestions specific to that as well. So hiring process could be involving them. They're interested in a job. How are we going about hiring? Do we have committees, you know, et cetera? So there is opportunity for community members to be involved in the hiring process. And so was something that I felt was at least a component in providing evidence to input into school matters. You don't see that connection?
Yeah, I'm struggling with it. I was also just a little concerned about, you know, having it in here sort of makes it feel like the community should have potentially direct input into hiring matters, which is a little more concerning. So for example, you know, I have had people come to me and say, well, I really liked such and such person who was teaching my child, but they were on a one-year contract and now they're being replaced permanently by someone else. Why didn't you just keep this person? And, you know, I've had to explain, you know, what a one-year contract means and, you know, how all of that works. And I was just a little concerned that this opens us up to questions about, you know, how
Right.
involved the community should be in specific hiring decisions and that kind of thing.
It doesn't mean that they were, but I see what you're saying. And then the updating job descriptions, I think, is just a way of increasing transparency, is to allow for input so that there's clarity around the jobs that we do and
Yep.
whether they're thinking about, you know, applying into the school or they have people that they know. It's about also receiving input and collaboration back and forth.
Yeah.
Anything else? All right, sounds like those will get
Thank you.
reworked. All right, we'll move on to agenda item 11, review topics for other paper articles. It's in here somewhere,
Yeah,
right?
it's on the back of the master planning revision.
So next week, Alex will submit her article on student representative responsibilities. And we've got Steve up on the Governor's Healthcare Committee, which is expected to report out mid-November. And then Martin, you're up on responsibility of the school board.
Yep.
Is there anything we want to cue in for a early February run? Either looking at the topics that are under consideration or something new?
Well,
Budget?
budget, yeah. That's gonna be the big one before
Yeah, I
the
think we
budget
kind
is
of
due.
targeted, yeah.
I'm happy to take that one. I've
Alright.
been ducking responsibility for a while on the paper.
Okay,
Because I'm just gonna be
we're gonna stay a little bit ahead. Anything else that's top of mind we ought to put on the running tab? All right, seeing nothing, we'll move on to agenda item 12, setting the agenda for November 1st.
So I may need to look at those number 11 executive limitation policies, but just because that may be a little bit aggressive.
So on number 9, can we have action on the potential deadline changes?
Deadline, date changes.
Can we have
Yeah,
that
put
on
action on
first, because I'm not going to be here on the 15th, and I want to be part of that conversation.
Okay. So the recommendation is to put action.
Yeah.
Or do you want to just leave it as discussion and put action underneath a bullet or date changes, to be clear to the public?
I think it should, yeah, just for deadlines.
Yeah, or maybe
Just for-
timeline adjustments or
Right, you know what I'm
something.
saying, 'cause people,
Yeah.
Adjustment.
That's-
Yeah.
so we'll do
Don't be
time.
thinking that we're consolidating a
Time-
Do we want to add an agenda item on the VSBA discussion, resolution discussion?
I was going to actually ask for something a little broader than that, and that's just legislation. If I can report back, but
Mhm.
also if the board is going to want to, as a board, weigh in on any issues in the upcoming session.
Want to add legislative input?
So are we looking for input to give to the legislators?
Yeah, I mean, to see if there's anything that the board like 3 years ago, we put together a memo that these are our 4 issues, and we worked a bit on that so that, I don't know that it affected any policies being made in the state.
As I
So it may not
recall,
have been
it
worth
fell a
the
little
effort.
flat.
We will just do it orally this time.
Yeah.
So,
And is that, do we want to consider, and we haven't talked, maybe we have, about a legislative breakfast, but that,
Yeah,
do
we
we want
won't,
that to
we do
coincide?
not have another city school meeting until November 10th, so, but if we had some items to take to that meeting with the idea of a
That would-
legislative breakfast, that would be good timing.
yeah, I mean, maybe between now and the first, I know we've talked a little bit about
I have,
Mhm.
an issue, and maybe there's more, that I can get something sent out to folks.
Okay.
And if anybody has other ideas, let me know.
so we'll add legislative
Just
input
input, yeah.
as an agenda
Mhm.
item. Okay.
Thank you.
Anything else? All right, agenda item 13, future agenda items. Anything coming off the list? Or
The-
anything that needs to be added?
Our support staff employee manual is, I think, near done, but we'll let you see that,
Okay.
at least take a look at it, but we're pretty close. That's all I see at the moment.
Moving on to agenda item 14, we have 4 meetings to cover. We'll start with October 2nd. Any changes to that, those minutes?
No.
All right, seeing none, those are approved. That was a working session. October 3rd.
$2:43 a.m. was the timestamp.
Official time.
Wow. This brings it back. Start at 5 PM, out 2:43 AM. Seeing no changes, those are accepted. October 4th, regular meeting. Seeing none, those are accepted. And October 6th.
Stuff we covered, too.
This was a special meeting on ratification.
So, a question on this. Do we,
October 6th?
on the October 6th, do we have to note in the minutes that it was taken by, it was by a roll call vote? I assume that that's sufficient, that we
Yeah.
don't have to name the
Yep.
individuals and their votes, since it says unanimous. I take that back, it's fine.
All right. Seeing none, those are accepted. All right, we'll move on to the consent agenda.
So you have a 1.0 special ed elementary teacher change Chamberlain. This was part of, again, I placed by your side a little description of the new hire report. Morgan Milhomes, again, kindergarten with dual certification in special education. She comes in, she's a step one teacher and prorated based on the start date. And again, this was also, we had one position that was a contingency position that was approved, that went to Orchard, and this was the other position that was approved, just to bring people back to where we were. And we've hired the other person, obviously earlier. And then the bids are for the architectural and structural mechanical. Bridget alluded to that earlier. I know she's at least had some time to look over and has maybe some questions, but I don't know, Bridget, where you're at with that.
My main concern was just that the way the proposal was structured, they sort of structured it as, you know, phase 1 and phase 2, but it seemed like it was a full proposal for both. I just want to be clear that we were only approving phase 1 so far. My main concerns were about phase 2, and this is probably something for a broader discussion at some other point. Phase 2 in the Dora Whittier proposal was really talking about having one of their in-house consultants sort of run the process of deciding what we want educationally. So sort of having a person, they have a person on staff who was a former math teacher, running, and the proposal was to run a process, working with, you know, our staff and our community to try to determine what we really thought the needs educationally at the middle school and the high school were, that would then feed into a proposal for, you know, what those upgrades would look like and all of that. And that, this is all phase 2 I'm talking about. I'm just deeply uncomfortable with the idea of an architectural firm being the one to sort of drive those discussions. And so I'm comfortable with phase 1 that's in their proposal. I just want to caveat that when we start to talk about phase 2, I think we need to sort of reframe that discussion a little bit. And I had talked to David sort of offline about it. I wasn't involved when the major master planning and visioning push happened the last time. I wasn't here for the task force and all that. I kind of came into that late at the point where we were just seeing the results of it. And I was quite surprised as we got to the end of the process after I was on the board, as we got to the end of our master planning and visioning process, that a lot of the numbers that we were looking at in terms of the potential costs of upgrades were very, very high level numbers. And I have no way of knowing whether that was because of the direction that we gave Dora Whittier, or whether that was how they actually produced on what we gave them in terms of a scope. And so as long as you're comfortable that they're doing good work and that they can deliver on the RFP and what they actually have in their proposal, I can be comfortable with that. I just have to say, coming in, I was very surprised that we got all the way to the end of our process last time with the community and everything, and then didn't have as much detail as I would have liked in terms of really understanding what the costs of those potential upgrades were. So I was a little uncomfortable with that. But as long as you're comfortable with that, I do agree that they obviously know the district better than any of the other respondents. And they've been involved in a lot of the work at the high school and the middle school in the past. So they sort of have a leg up in terms of previous knowledge that they should be able to bring to this project. And obviously their costs were in line with our budget and all of that. So I'm comfortable with that. Sorry for the long-winded
Thanks.
comment.
So is it fair to say that this bid is phase 1 only?
Correct.
Yes.
Can we just make sure in the minutes
Yep,
reflect that?
Yep.
And the IT van replacement?
Yes, so the IT van replacement is, well, actually, John, you want to just explain it?
Yeah, this is really below the threshold of kind of bid requirements and board review and all that. But we did want to at least have an FYI here that our proposal would be to take funds that we received from the sale of computer gear like we did last year, albeit a smaller amount, and replace a piece of equipment that we hadn't been able to budget. And this ends up with a very reasonable, about $3,000 or $4,000 net expense to the district. So we just hope that the
I asked it,
board-
I didn't, I just wanted to be transparent in front of the board. You know, under the executive limitations, I didn't need to do that, but I think, you know, it was technology, you know, that we, you know, received funds for, so again, I think the transparency is important, so.
Just out of curiosity, what are IT vans used for?
They're used to move equipment around. It's simply just a box van that we use to move bulk computers or, you know,
AV
when we're
equipment.
moving things around to different schools. The van that we've been using has been, it's not really, it's very close to not being inspectable and needs to be taken off the road, so we've gotten a good useful life out of the other one.
Thanks. All right. Any questions on AP orders 12, 13, or 14? All right. Seeing none, we'll move on to Agenda 17, which is an AP order check to Millbrook Building and Remodeling in the amount of $134,868.91. Can you get a little background on that?
That's a nearly final payment on the restroom renovation project going on right now at the high school. All that's remaining there are the punch list items. So this is another piece of that bond issue being completed.
And this isn't payment in full to them, is it?
No, it's still a punch list.
And after the punch list,
Retainage.
they get their
Right.
payment. Good.
We hold the retainage until
Oh, yeah.
done.
So I move that we approve the accounts payable order check to Millbrook Building and Remodeling, Inc. in the amount of $134,868.91.
Second?
Thanks, Mark.
Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
And the motion passes.
I move that
Do
we
I have a
adjourn.
motion to adjourn?
So moved.
All in favor?
Aye.
And we are adjourned.